Uh, Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us in this concluding session of this event in celebration 20 years of Grupo Hume. It is with great happiness and a deep sentiment of honor that I invite Professor Don Garrett from NYU and Jeffrey Sayre-McCord from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to present to us their joint talks entitled, in the case of Professor Don Garrett, Finding the Human Value, Finding the Human Value in Humanity, and Professor Jeffrey Sayre-McCord's Hume's Robust Theory of Practical Reason. These two eminent scholars and philosophers are very important and meaningful for the world study on Hume in Brazil for the past decades. Their influence, their constant presence, their generous support of study and research, their rational interpretation have left us with a legacy that's impossible to measure. So wonderful, so great, so significant it is. It is the gratitude and affection and admiration that I welcome Professor Garrett and Sayre-McCord to give us the talks that conclude this happy event. Thank you both and welcome.
Well, thank you. First, let me express my appreciation to the organizers, Alana, Venetius, and Livia for this great conference. Let me also express my appreciation to the speakers I've heard, those who spoke in English, all of whom have illuminated our understanding of Hume and touched on matters related to my topic today. Simon Blackburn gave a very economical account of Hume's economy of methodology as applied to 5 or 6 topics, including theism and divine providence, human nature and virtue. Jackie Taylor explained the principle of humanity and how it makes us participants in the party of mankind. Angela Coventry discussed the passions and their correction for variations of proximity and distance. And all of those topics will come up. Finally, special thanks to the founders of Grupo Hume, Livia, Bruno, Marcos, and Aniche. There is really nothing else like this group in the entire world. We're very fortunate to be hearing from them. The photos Aniche shared in the opening session gave great additional force to my memories of happy visits in the past. It's almost as though I am in the courtyard of UFMG near the bust of Kant right now. So vivid is my imagination of it. Let me see if I can share my slides. Okay, so my topic is finding the Humean value in Humean humanity. This is my epigraph. It is also an epigram. I usually confuse epigrams and epigraphs, so this is both. It's about understanding mankind from one of my favorite authors, Jack Handey, his book, Deep Thoughts. Maybe in order to understand mankind, we have to look at the word itself. Basically, it's made up of two separate words, mank and eind. What do these words mean? It's a mystery, and that's why so is mankind. We will, however, try to talk about mankind. Kant, whom I almost feel is looking over my shoulder during this entire talk, has a famous answer to the question, what is the value of humanity? He's a moral rationalist and an anti-rationalist, and his answer is that the value of humanity, that is instantiated human nature, is fundamentally moral value that is both recognized by and consists in the rationality rather than the sensibility of human beings as nominally free agents with a nature that is, or character that is outside of nature. Hume, on the other hand, is a moral anti-rationalist and a naturalist. So what's his answer to this question? He didn't formulate this question in those terms, so I'll try to fill in the gap by investigating Hume's answers to these questions, or two preliminary questions. What is humanity, according to Hume? And what is the source of value in general? Not just in humanity, but in general. And then there are two central questions. How does humanity in particular have value? And what is the role of reason in the value of humanity? And then there will be three further questions. Does value pertain only to human beings? Is there value in each human being? And is there value in humanity as a species or as a whole? Okay, so first, what is humanity? So Hume uses the term humanity in three different senses. One sense, human nature or its possession. That's roughly the sense of Kant's question, or membership in the human species. So in Of the Rise and Progress of the Arts and Sciences, he says of Alexander the Great that he was convinced of his humanity by the fact that he needed to sleep, and those around him by his other weaknesses were also convinced of his humanity, that is, that he was not a god but had human nature. Secondly, there's human beings collectively. That is what Hume more commonly calls the human species or mankind or humankind. So in Of National Characters, he says that the clergy, in virtue of their position, are elevated above humanity, by which that might mean above human nature, but the context is they still have human nature, rather they are elevated above the other members of the human species by their office. Hume's most common use of the term humanity by far is to mean humaneness, or as he also says, concern for others or fellow feeling for others. Jackie Taylor talked about humanity in that sense in the inquiry concerning the principles of morals. It's both a psychological principle comparable to self-love and also a kind of feelings. There are feelings of humanity. So that's Hume's most common sense of the term, but I'm talking about humanity in the more Kantian sense of human nature, possession of which humanity in the sense of humaneness is just one aspect. Worth noting that humanity in this third sense may be directed at sensible creatures, that is sentient creatures, who are not human, for example, beasts or mere animals. And in English, we still have that sense of being humane involves treatment of animals as well as of human beings. So human beings and other species of animals may be compared, and Hume does compare them. There are many, as he says, many similarities of bodily composition and organs, which allow inferences about causal mechanisms from one species to the other. So if we discover something about the circulation of blood or chyle in one species, we're entitled to make an inference to something similar in other species. And Hume proposes that there are also similarities of mental composition and faculties that allow inferences in the same way about causal operations from one species to another. Notice for Hume, there really is mental composition, since minds are bundles of perceptions and are composed of them with a physiological basis in the brain. So Hume talks about, has a section devoted to the reason of animals, a section devoted to the pride and humility of animals, a section devoted to the love and hatred of animals, by which he means not our love and hatred for animals, but rather that the love and hatred that animals have towards each other, towards us, and many other passions, including desire and aversion. On the other hand, there are some differences. He says animals have lesser knowledge and understanding, and that explains some things. They have little or no sense of virtue or vice, hence there is no section on the virtue of animals or the moral sense of animals. They quickly lose sight of the relations of blood, and they are incapable of that is the sense of right and property, not surprisingly, since that requires entering into a convention. So there are some shared features of human and animal bodies and minds. One is that they exhibit adaptation of means to ends in the interaction of their parts, both the parts of their bodies and the parts of their minds, as Hume emphasizes with our belief in bodies and our tendency to make inductive inferences. But this is not part of any evident providential order, so it tells us nothing about God. They are fully subject to deterministic laws of nature, both minds and bodies, animals and humans, so they don't have any kind of freedom that is outside of nature. They are mortal, both in their minds and bodies, both animals and humans, as he argues in The Immortality of the Soul. So you might have noticed that dispatches Kant's three subjects of rational faith, for which we must regard ourselves as being somehow outside of nature: God, freedom, and immortality. Okay, so what is the source of value in general? Here's a preview from The Skeptic. And I should say I'm going to be quoting from The Skeptic a fair amount. It turns out that a lot of what Hume has to say about value is in The Skeptic. The Skeptic is, of course, an essay written in the character of a skeptic. And so there's always the question of whether everything in it is something that Hume agrees with. It's the same question we face about Philo in the dialogues. My view is that Hume identifies himself as a skeptic, so you would expect that the skeptic would say things Hume would agree with. And in fact, there's nothing in this essay that Hume is known to disagree with. So I'm going to take this as expressing Hume's views. So here's the passage. Nature has given all animals a like prejudice in favor of their offspring. As soon as the helpless infant sees the light, though in every other eye it appears a despicable and a miserable creature, it is regarded by its fond parent with the utmost affection. The passion alone, arising from the original structure and formation of human nature, bestows a value on the most insignificant object. So, as we know, for Hume, ultimate values do not depend on reason. As he says in the first appendix to the second inquiry, it is impossible there can be a progress in infinitum, and that one thing can always be a reason why another is desired. Something must be desirable on its own account, and because of its immediate accord or agreement with human sentiment and affection. That's a key phrase. Similarly, it appears in the same place as it appears evident that the ultimate ends of human action can never in any case be accounted for by reason, but recommend themselves entirely to the sentiments and affections of mankind without any dependence on intellectual faculties. So there Hume is both making a claim about that ultimate values and ends don't depend on reason, and he's drawing a distinction between ultimate ends or values and instrumental ends or values, which a distinction which anyone must make and which Kant makes also. So I think you can see there that there really are two sources of value for Hume: sentiment and passion. Oh, as he also says in The Skeptic, if we can depend upon any principle which we learn from philosophy, This, I think, must be considered as certain and undoubted, that there is nothing in itself valuable or despicable, desirable or hateful, beautiful or deformed, but these attributes arise from the particular constitution and fabric of human sentiment and affection. And then later he says, the value of every object can be determined only by the sentiment or passion of every individual. So I take it when Hume says sentiment and affection, he's not just using two terms for the same thing. Whenever he describes affections, they are always passions that he gives examples of. And I take it he's using the term affection as a synonym for passion. And so some values arise from sentiment, some arise from passion. Valuable or despicable in that first passage captures both kinds of value. Desirable or hateful is a kind of passion that value that depends on passion, whereas beautiful or deformed depends on sentiment. And notice he says the value of every object can be determined by the sentiment or passion of every individual, only by the sentiment or passion of every individual. That's determination as metaphysical, that is, it's having the value really does depend on the investment by sentiment and passion. And it's also epistemological, that's how we discover what things have value. So this distinction between sentiments and values, it's drawn at the beginning of book 2 of the treatise, where Hume says the reflective impressions, that is impressions of reflection, may be divided into two kinds, namely the calm and the violent. Of the first kind is, for example, the sense of beauty and deformity in action, composition, and external objects. He hasn't mentioned virtue yet, so at this point in the treatise, so that's not an example yet. Of the second kind are, for example, the passions of love and hatred, grief and joy, pride and humility. This division is far from being exact, as Angie explained. The raptures of poetry and music frequently rise to the greatest height, while those other impressions, the ones that are properly called passions, may decay into so soft an emotion as to become in a manner imperceptible. But as in general, the passions are more violent than the emotions arising from beauty and deformity, these impressions have been commonly distinguished from each other. So as I take it here at the beginning of book 2, Hume is drawing a distinction between sentiments and passions and giving you the examples of them. And it's a distinction based on the calmness or violence of the type. That is the typical calmness or violence. So any desire is a passion, even though it itself, in a particular token of it, may not be particularly violent, may be very calm. Later on in the treatise, he also distinguishes between calm and violent tokens. And of course, in fact, he's implicitly doing that in the second passage. But there's a difference between calling desire for good or pleasure in general a calm passion. That means it's a token that is calm, but it still belongs to the violent type, namely the type desires. So all desires are passions. All sentiments of beauty or deformity, no matter the raptures to which they rise, are still sentiments. So there are passion-based values. We can characterize them this way. They are derived from a faculty, which he generally calls the passions. Here are some key perceptions provided by that faculty: desire or aversion, love or hatred, pride or humility. And there are certain values that are determined in his technical sense, positive or negative, by these passions. That is, being desirable or odious. That's usually what he opposes to the desirable. Estimable or contemptible. Lovable or the opposite. Worthy of pride or the opposite. He doesn't use the term lovable. Estimable includes both love and a certain amount of humility at the object of love. Contemptible, something is contemptible, that involves contempt, which is a mixture of hatred and pride, mostly hatred, but some pride. So the vulgar, he says, locate this kind of value, passion-based value, in the mind. That is, it's not spread or projected onto their objects. So as he says in The Skeptic, Who is not sensible that power and glory and vengeance are not desirable in of themselves, but derive all their value from the structure of human passions to desire such particular pursuits? So the vulgar treat those values as being in the mind. There are also sentiment-based values. Here, the faculty is what he calls taste, as opposed to the passions. Some key perceptions are feelings of beauty or deformity, that's his term, moral approbation or moral disapprobation. And the values determined, positive or negative, are beauty or deformity. And the vulgar locate these values in the objects, as he continues in the passage from the previous slide. But with regard to beauty, either natural or moral beauty being virtue, the case is commonly supposed to be different. The agreeable quality is thought to lie in the object, not in the sentiment. And that merely because the sentiment is not so turbulent and violent as to distinguish itself in an evident manner from the perception of the object. So there is a process of correction, which Andrew Coventry also talked about, in passion-based values. Oh, in The Skeptic, he says, we may observe that the passion, in pronouncing its verdict, that is, its verdict of value, considers not the object simply as it is in itself, but surveys it with all the circumstances which attend it. Here, therefore, a philosopher may step in and suggest particular views and considerations and circumstances which otherwise would have escaped us. And by that means, he may either moderate or excite any particular passion. So passions have different degrees depending on the particular view in which we take them. And that allows us to draw a distinction between things that are actually desired and things that are desirable. So some things are desirable, although no one actually desires them. And on the other hand, some things are desired, although they are not really desirable. And in different degrees, some things are desired greatly, which are only slightly desirable. It has been observed, he says, in treating of the passions, that men are mightily governed by the imagination and proportion their affections more, that is their passions, more to the light under which any object appears to them than to its real and intrinsic value. There he doesn't mean its ultimate value, but rather its corrected value, the value that it really should be given. Everything that is contiguous to us commonly operates with more force, and things that are distant with less force, and that was just the kind of correction that Angie was talking about. So we can correct actual desire up or down. There's also, of course, maybe more famously, correcting for variation in sentiment-based values. So Hume says in the treatise, in order, therefore, to prevent these continual contradictions in attributions of virtue based just on our immediate feeling, and arrive at a more stable judgment of things, we fix on some steady and general points of view, perspectives, and always in our thoughts place ourselves in them, whatever may be our present situation. In like manner, external beauty is determined merely by pleasure, and 'tis evident a beautiful countenance, that is a pleasing sentiment of beauty, determined merely by pleasure, and 'tis evident a beautiful countenance cannot give so much pleasure when seen at the distance of 20 paces as when it is brought nearer us. We say not, however, that it appears to us less beautiful, because we know what effect it will have in such a position, and by that reflection we correct its momentary appearance. Now, so far I've talked about beauty and virtue as sentiment-based values, but there's also epistemic value that's based on a somewhat different kind of sentiment. That is, it's not itself an impression of reflection. So famously in the treatise, he says, thus all probable reasoning is nothing but a species of sensation, feeling. 'Tis not solely in poetry and music we must follow our taste and sentiment, as we do in poetry and music, but likewise in philosophy we must follow our taste and sentiment. When I am convinced of any principle, 'tis only an idea which strikes more strongly upon me. When I give the preference to one set of arguments above another, I do nothing but decide from my feeling concerning the superiority of their influence. So here we can see two more faculties, reason, what he's talking about in this passage, but the senses work in a similar way. That is, the senses as they inform us of continued and distinct bodies outside of us. The key perception in this case is the sentiment of belief, which is not a separate impression, but rather the force and vivacity, or what he calls the evidence, that is the subjective evidence, the evidentness of some state of affairs to us. So the idea has force and vivacity, that is the sentiment of belief. It gives the proposition evidentness, makes it evident. And the values that are immediately determined here, positive or negative, are the probably true and the probably false. And there's a distinction between something merely feeling probably true and it's really being probably true. You have to correct seeming probabilities to get the correct probability. And you can see in the treatise him talking about correcting the sentiment of belief. So he says, in a poetical enthusiasm, reflection on general rules keeps us from augmenting our belief upon every increase of the force and vivacity of our ideas. We feel more force and veracity, but we correct downwards. Where an opinion admits of no doubt or opposite probability, we attribute to it a full conviction, though the want of resemblance or contiguity may render its force inferior to that of other opinions. So if it's a dull or boring subject or concerns something different to us, we don't feel much liveliness, but we correct it upwards. Because thus the understanding corrects the appearances of the senses also and makes us imagine that an object at 20-foot distance seems even to the eye as large as one of the same dimensions at 10. There's another very important passage, maybe the most important passage in the first inquiry to my mind. A quote, "There is indeed a more mitigated skepticism or academical philosophy, which may be both durable and useful, and which may in part be the result of this Pyrrhonism or excessive skepticism, when its undistinguished doubts, those of excessive skepticism, those undistinguished doubts are in some measure corrected by common sense and reflection. That is, the level of doubt is too great and should be adjusted down, the level of doubt, and hence the degree of belief should be adjusted upward." Okay, so this kind of correction is ubiquitous in Hume. Such corrections, he says, are here he's talking about correcting moral sentiments. Such corrections are common with regard to all the senses, and indeed, for impossible we could ever make use of language or communicate our sentiments to one another did we not correct the momentary appearances of things and overlook our present situation. But correction doesn't always yield a unique verdict. Sometimes we just have blameless diversity. Good judges from the same perspective would nevertheless have a different feeling. Sometimes we just say there's no definite right or wrong answer, but about which is the best genre of poetry. Or sometimes we allow subject relativity, that is, that's virtuous to this nation, but vicious to some other nation, for some other nation. So there's blameless diversity and or subject relativity and kinds of value in roughly descending order. I think passion-based value is most subject to blameless diversity and subject relativity, desirability and odiousness of things. Sometimes we just blamelessly disagree about exactly how something desirable is. And sometimes we say, you know, that's desirable for you with your tastes, but it's not desirable for me with mine. It's not surprising that there should be more of that in the passion-based values, because even the vulgar recognize that the value in this case is in the mind and not spread onto the object. There's less, but still quite a lot of blameless diversity and subject relativity and aesthetic value, that is beauty or deformity. Somewhat less, but there's still some in questions of moral virtue as a value, virtue or vice. And there's some in epistemic value with degrees of evidence of propositions or their probability of truth. Okay, so that's enough about value in general. How does humanity have value? Well, we've seen there are two kinds of value. There's passion-based value. How does that play out in human beings? Well, human beings are desirable. That is, they have desirability. They're desirable as cooperators in society, for 'tis by society alone a human being is able to supply his defects, raise himself up to an equality with his fellow creatures, that is animals, and even acquire a superiority above them. By the conjunction of forces, our power is augmented. By the partition of employments, our ability increases, and by mutual succor, we are less exposed to fortune and accidents. We are also desirable as company. As he says, we love company in general. Just as we love any other amusement. He's making a point there that it's not a special kind, but he does typically emphasize what an important kind it is. Indeed, nothing is more enjoyable than the company of those we esteem. Human beings are also desirable as objects of the passion for generation. That's one distinctive sense of desirable. The appetite for generation, Hume also calls lust, and it instigates affection between the sexes, what he calls affection betwixt the sexes, which is a more complex phenomenon involving both the appetite for generation, stirring an appreciation of beauty, which leads to affection, love. And that's a complex thing. And of course, some human beings are desirable as objects of natural affection for offspring, as we desire to have offspring, and we desire to be with our offspring. Desirability is not the only passion-based value in human beings. They are also lovable. They're lovable for their qualities. Typically, those qualities are also desirable and make the people themselves desirable. But we love people for any quality of a person or a saliently related object to the person that causes pleasure. But notably, human nature merely as such is not a lovable quality. Human nature as such allows us to have many qualities that are lovable. But he insists we don't love people just for their having human nature. In general, he says it may be affirmed that there is no such passion in human minds as the love of mankind merely as such, independent of personal qualities, of services, or of relation to oneself. Sympathy is no proof of a universal affection to mankind, since this concern extends itself beyond our own species. It's not limited to humankind. And speaking of sympathy, resemblance to the subject can also be a cause of love and hence a source of lovability, since sympathy depends on our appreciating similarities between ourselves and those with whom we sympathize. And when we sympathize with someone long enough, we tend to desire the same things that they desire. We desire the same ends. And so by the similar direction of the passions, we can come to love them. For example, pity, which results from a sympathy with pain, produces love. And that's because it interests us in the fortunes of others, good or bad. So sympathy can also lead to love. There's also passion-based value in human beings in their worthiness for a due pride. So he says, but though an overweening conceit of our own merit be vicious and disagreeable, nothing can be more laudable, and hence virtuous as well, than to have a value for ourselves, where we really have qualities that are valuable. So our own pride can be a source of value when directed at ourselves in virtue of our qualities. Okay, but so there are passion-based kinds of value in human beings. There are also sentiment-based kinds of value in human beings. There's aesthetic value, that is beauty. Ultimate, that is not instrumental. Some human beings are beautiful. And there's also instrumental aesthetic value in human beings, insofar as human beings can be causes of beauty. They can be instrumental to the production of beauty. There's moral value in human beings, both ultimate, that is, virtuous human beings are valued for their own sake, for the sake of their value, although for the sake of their virtue. Although they do please us by their virtue, we don't admire them for their ability to produce pleasure in us. We admire them for their virtue. There's also instrumental moral value. Human beings can be causes of virtue in others. As once said of President Gerald Ford, he is not only dull in himself, but the cause of dullness in others. People can be virtuous and also causes of virtue in others. So it's an important point to note. So I'll say this slowly. It is virtuous, and hence it's of moral value, to value many things that are not themselves virtuous, but are of non-moral value. So for example, commerce is very valuable to Hume. Commerce is not itself of moral value, but it's a virtue to value commerce, because people who value commerce are useful and produce pleasure to those around them. So it can be, I'm saying that I'm treating moral virtue as virtue that's specifically moral value is value that's related specifically to virtue, but the valuing of many other things that are not themselves of moral value, can themselves be virtuous. In that sense, they have a kind of morality related value. Finally, there's epistemic value. So I said the things we primarily value epistemically are beliefs for truth and probable truth. But we also value wisdom and good sense in people who have probably true beliefs and mental operations that lead to them. And of course, wisdom and good sense are also on Hume's list of virtues. So they also have moral value, but they also, human beings who are wise and have good sense themselves have some epistemic value as well. They are, there's ultimate value as wise and knowing human beings, and as more instrumental as causes of wisdom and knowledge, that is, as sources of wisdom and knowledge for other people. Okay, the final question in this section is exactly how much sentiment-based value does humanity have? Because we've got some of quite a lot of different kinds, and Hume addresses this very question in his essay of the dignity or meanness of human nature. So he says there that there is a natural difference between merit and demerit. It's important, it's a natural difference between merit and demerit, virtue and vice, wisdom and folly, no reasonable man will deny. So extreme skeptics deny that there's a natural difference between wisdom and folly, but they're unreasonable. Total moral skeptics deny that there's a natural difference between virtue and vice, they're unreasonable. Yet it is evident that in affixing the term which denotes either approbation or blame, we are commonly more influenced by comparison than by any fixed, unalterable standard in the nature of things. So, he says, the virtue and wisdom of humanity are great when compared with animals. We are so smart and we are so virtuous compared to animals. On the other hand, the virtue and wisdom of humanity are negligible when compared with imaginary perfect beings that we set up for ourselves as models. And the category of the wise, the virtuous, and the beautiful are necessarily rare among human beings when compared with other human beings. That is, in order to be considered one of the wise or one of the virtuous or one of the beautiful, you necessarily have to rise above the common level of humanity, whatever level that is. So it shouldn't be a source of surprise that few people are among the virtuous or the wise. No matter how wise or virtuous human beings were, only those who were elevated above that level would be considered the wise and the virtuous. I take it Hume aspired to be among the wise and the virtuous. He had no illusions about his own beauty, I think. But he does mention the observation, beauty being relative, that although, of course, few women are among the beautiful because judged by the standard of the average, what passes for beautiful among men would really be pretty ugly among women. That is, the standards of beauty for men are extremely low because they reach a very low bar. But he concludes, those philosophers who have insisted so much on the selfishness of man have been led astray to greatly exaggerate human vice. So although he's not weighing in on the exact amount of selfishness and altruism in human beings, those who insist so much on the selfishness of man are exaggerating human vice. There is certainly some virtue, considerable amount of virtue there, compared to what determines whether we say it's great or small. Okay, so what is the role of reason in the value of humanity? As we've seen, he says it appears evident that the ultimate ends of human action can never in any case be accounted for by reason, but recommend themselves entirely to the sentiments and affections, that is, passions of mankind, without any dependence on the intellectual faculties. So there are many contributions of reason, nevertheless, to value in human beings. And in talking about reason in Hume, I mean what Hume means by reason, the faculty of making inferences. Jeff will talk about it in a more expansive sense. But reason as the faculty of making inferences We've seen that reason alone can't determine ultimate values, but it contributes to the determination, both metaphysical and epistemological, the determination by passion and sentiment of value by human beings, in human beings, and to human beings. That is, to the extent that there's subject relativity of value, it's value to human beings. Through, on the one hand, discovering means to ends, and hence instrumental values as well as ultimate values, and the effects of qualities that determines whether or not they are lovable, for example, or appropriate subjects of pride or desire. And also in enabling the correction of sentiments and passions for perspective. You have to reason about what the result of being in a particular perspective would be in order to make those corrections. So reason helps with determining value, but it also plays a crucial role in the possession of value. Reason contributes to possessing the value of desirability as a cooperator, as company. Somebody with no reason is not very good company. As a romantic partner, and so on. Contributes to lovability versus via many useful qualities, and also via resemblance for sympathy. That is, having reason is one of the ways in which we resemble other human beings, and hence one of the factors that leads to our being able to sympathize with them by seeing them as similar to ourselves. Certainly a matter of worthiness for due pride. Reason probably doesn't contribute to making you beautiful, but at least helps you cause beauty. Maybe you can reason about beauty tips and thereby make yourself more beautiful. Reason certainly contributes to having virtue. You have to have reason to exercise most virtues and in causing virtue. And of course, reason contributes to both having and causing wisdom and good sense. But sensibility also makes contributions to the value of human beings. And by sensibility, I mean the faculty of having sensation and feeling, what Hume means by it. And once again, it's of two kinds. Sensibility helps in the determination of value. Here, sensibility does determine values by human beings, in human beings, and to human beings through passion and sentiment. And sensibility contributes to the possession of value, possessing the values of desirability as a cooperator, as company, as a romantic partner. Those all require sensibility. Lovability for useful personal qualities, and as a mode of resemblance, we have the same feelings as others. Worthiness for due pride, in causing beauty, in having and causing virtue, and in having and causing wisdom and good sense. Okay, so both reason and sensibility play crucial roles in value in human beings. Of course, there are many kinds of desirable things that are not human beings and that don't have reason and sentiment. Pizza has neither reason and sentiment, but is nevertheless desirable. But value in human beings, a great deal of it depends on reason and sensibility. Okay, so three final further questions. Does value pertain only to human beings? Is there value in each human being? Is there value in humanity as a whole or as a species? Does value pertain only to human beings? So we don't know about deities. Whether one or more deities have the kind of sensibility and reason necessary to determine value or to possess many kinds of value is at best unknown. It seems unlikely. But at least many species of animals are known to have enough sensibility and reason that make them suitable to determining value. It will at least be uncorrected value by them. I know that animals draw a distinction between what they desire and what is desirable for them. But they can determine uncorrected value by, they can do it by themselves and value to themselves, things that are valuable to them. And they can determine value that is in both themselves when they love one another or take pride in themselves, as peacocks do for their beauty, for example, and value in human beings when they find human beings lovable, as they do. Hume says dogs typically love us more than they do members of their own species. We've bred them to do that, actually, but that's a true fact about dogs. And of course, many of them find us desirable for company. Some of them find us desirable as food. So they determine desire-based values, desirability, lovability, both by qualities and by sympathy. They sympathize with us. And worthiness for pride. He especially mentions beauty, since animals don't have a moral sense, they don't take pride in their virtue. But they do, he says, take pride in their beauty. They don't take pride in their parentage because they lose track of relations of blood. And they determine sentiment-based values of at least beauty, but not virtue. And they possess value to themselves as well as having value to human beings. Desirable for cooperation and company and other things too. Lovability, worthiness for due pride, and they possess sentiment-based values, at least beauty. Hume does say at one point that we can imagine a virtuous horse by having had previous impressions of virtue and of a horse. Not clear whether he thinks that there are virtuous horses, although you might think there are good dogs as virtuous dogs, even though they don't have a moral sense, they may still have virtues. Or he may just be imagining a horse that has human virtues, can talk, and so on. A sort of human nature in a horse form, or there may be distinctive equine virtues. Second question, is there value in each human being? Well, every human being with human reason and sensibility, at least, you might say clearly determines some passion-based and sentiment-based value and possesses at least some passion-based value and some sentiment-based value, beauty and virtue or wisdom, at least a bit, at least compared with animals. And of course, in addition, it is a virtue, hence morally valuable, to value and respect other sentient human beings. Worth noting, though, that the value of each human being does not imply that there is a duty against suicide, as he argues in the essay of Suicide. Is there value in humanity as a whole? So a species composed of individuals, each having value, presumably has collective value, presumably some ways sum up or collect that value, but the continuation of the human species with the many kinds of value that perpetuates is itself desirable to human beings. That is, you can just see that human beings desire it, and even when they correct for perspective, they continue to desire it. And in addition, it's arguably virtuous, that is, of moral value, to value the continuation of the human species. That is, we do admire people who do desire the value of the human species. Of course, other species of sensible creatures also have values as wholes, both collectively through their individual value, and at least to human beings in their continuation. That is, we desire the continuation of endangered species. Not clear whether members of endangered species desire that for themselves, that is, as a species, but we do, and that makes that desirable. Okay, so we're back to the original question. What is the value of humanity? Kant, the moral rationalist and the anti-rationalist, says the value of humanity, instantiated human nature, is fundamentally moral value that is both recognized by and consists in the rationality, not the sensibility of human beings as nominally free agents outside of nature. Hume, the moral anti-rationalist and naturalist, answers humanity as a part of nature has many kinds of value, including moral value, that are determined by sentiment or passion as assisted by reason, and which typically also depend for their possession on having both reason and sensibility. That seems like a pretty good answer to me. It's certainly a valuable one to consider. Thank you.
Please, thank you very much, Professor Garrett, for your magnificent talk. I should like to know, how would you like to proceed? To have a discussion of your paper or go straight ahead to Professor Jeff Sayre-McCord presentation?
Either way is fine with me. Does Jeff have a preference?
Hi, Jeff. Can you hear us?
Yes. Just a sec. Start my video.
So what do you say?
So I say let's have a discussion of this wonderful paper. It's wonderful too for me because my paper follows on in the spirit of Don's. And so I think it'd be especially helpful for people to ask questions about Don's first.
So do you want to start the discussion?
I'll be talking more than people can stand. So I won't start it unless others don't have questions, but I suspect other people will.
Okay. May I start it then?
Sure.
Before we receive questions from the Jeff, please keep your microphone open so that you can intervene if you like it.
Okay.
Because I want to read your insight. Before we will be receiving questions from you. Before they arrive, I should like to just throw in some thoughts, and you are not supposed to answer anything that you don't find reasonable or, worth of.
Only denying the distinction between vice and folly or virtue and
A
vice.
folly.
The only thing that's
Think
unreasonable.
about folly, okay?
Okay. Folly. All right.
Well, I don't understand why you are so very much attracted to the vocabulary and language and moral language of value, since Hume did need it, and I too do not need it. I'm an ignorance, so I don't know its origin. But value is something that has spontaneous associations to me with property, good exchanges, and all of that kind of vile commerce that really disagree with the beauty of virtue. First question. Second question, I just wanted to add that at some point Hume kind of, I believe, innocently, I don't know whether he means it, says that we mostly judge things by comparison. But if we take a philosopher's point of view, we are able to judge of virtue and vice by ourselves. It's a. Do you remember that?
We are able to judge of virtue and vice by, I just missed the word.
By its own by its own worth.
By its own worth.
Not necessarily needing the comparison. I love your presentation because it makes so much sense to me. Even though you don't, I mean, you're using value. I'm just I'm just being how do you say? I'm just being silly because the content is perfect. And it is perfect because I'm struggling a couple of years now, or more than a couple of years now, with readers of the second inquiry that like Jackie Taylor, for example, that put so much emphasis on utility and the mysterious principle of humanity that is sound like an abstraction. And have not much to do with a human way to approach our sentiments and our ways of being together and feel for each other. Sentiment simply disappear. It's a matter of interest and this humility that is not humane. It's rational deliberation in most cases. And I hope to see in your written book or paper a more developed explanation of reason, the example of reason possessing, because the first instance as a mean devising means and etc. That is orthodox Hume. But the second case, and you say reason is our faculty of making inference, it's a presentation of reason very much out of text of the workings of reason in matters of fact. And I should like to see it, you put in your hands, working with concrete examples, because like getting your hands dirty on real case of reason possessing value, because that's really difficult for me to imagine. And finally, I love your three final questions: value in individuals, in animals, and in humanity as a whole. Only I think Hume would never pose it the question of the value of humanity as a whole, because humanity for him would never be contained in the thought of a whole. I think that humanity is something like Wittgenstein's city, something that has, when Wittgenstein describes a city that has no beginning and no end, is in a continuous process of change, and you can never define its frontiers. Do you remember that example in Wittgenstein? At the same time that you are building a new it, you are demolishing part of it. So you don't have in Hume ever, because a probabilistic philosophy of nature is always fluctuating, and the whole never crystallizes completely. So you have collectives, you have species. Species is a natural process, something naturally occurring, but wholes are objects of Greek philosophers, same other whole part. So I don't think this question would ever be in the spirit of Hume's philosophy because of the constant. What do you have to say about this feline? Thank you.
That was many wonderful questions. I did my best to write them down. So I should.
You don't have to answer them because I took too much of your time.
But I'll go back to the beginning and start. So why does Hume need value? He uses the notion of value. I agree that it's not central to his philosophy in the way that notions of vice and virtue, beauty, probability are. But when you look, you do find him using that notion. Surprisingly, the essay of the skeptic is really structured around it, but it comes up other places too, and even the determination of value. So it's not so much that he needs it as that he can, A, that he can use it, and B, I wanted to show that he can use it, because I think that sometimes people think, Kant quite superior to Hume in having an answer to the question, this deep question about the value of humanity. Honestly, I started thinking about this in relation to a conference on the value of humanity, in which sort of Kantian conception of the value of humanity was central. And so I wanted to say, you don't have to be a Kantian to have answers to questions about the value of humanity. It's not as though you are not in a position to address these things. As a Humean, you are in a position to give answers to these things, and answers that may be better than the anti-naturalist, rationalist Kantian answers. It's true that the notion of value is a general notion of value, and there's also an economic notion of value in political economy. Hume didn't have the term economics. And of course, that is a rough measure of value. Measures the extent to which people value something, the price they are willing to pay for it. But of course, the price that people are willing to pay for something doesn't determine how desirable it is in comparison with things that you can't pay for, and the ways in which it might be undesirable for other people that you should have the thing that you desire. So I take that entirely on board. So just mentioned Jackie yesterday started by making an allusion to the value of humanity, and she meant it in the sense, I think she said the value of humankind, which was just the question that I wanted. So even without this sort of framework, the notion of things having their own worth without comparison. So I think the notion of own worth can mean, is it ultimately valuable, or is it just instrumentally valuable? But I think in a way, correcting value is not so much a matter of just considering the thing as it is in itself, but considering it from a good perspective in its relations. So diamonds have little value in themselves. Actually, they're quite beautiful.
Right. Okay.
And you can use them to scratch things with. But they really do have a lot of value in human society, and appreciating that means taking the right perspective on them. Is humanity kind of an abstraction? Well, in a way, so humanity as human nature, although it's a very general term, it is the whole subject of a treatise of human nature. There's a whole book that is about humanity in the sense of human nature instantiated. Humanity as a species, I can just point to one obvious usage. I mean, he usually says mankind or humankind when he's talking about the species. Only once does he use humanity in that way. Reason is, of course, instrumental. It's valuable for the things that it produces. I want to say both that reason is valuable and that it is valuable to the human beings who have it, because it enables them to figure out through probable reasoning what causes they have to produce in order to get the effects that they want to produce. But that it also makes the people who have reason valuable, as it's valuable to them, but it also makes the people who have it valuable as they go about reasoning about causes and effects. So it does possess value. And what's the humanity as a whole, I agree, Hume doesn't ever consider the question of whether the human species might not continue. I think it's sort of in a Humean spirit to talk about the value of dogs as a species, not in the sense that we'll ever reach a point at which all the dogs that have ever lived will have lived, and then we can sum them all up. But at any given time, there's a sort of collectivity of dogs, and they have collective value and virtue of their members. I was really kind of
Okay.
trying to update on the question. I mean, for us, the question of whether human beings as a species will continue is a very salient question in the way that it wasn't for Hume. And I wanted to say what I thought his answer to that would be, but not because anywhere he said what his answer to that question would be. That's right. I'm just speaking on Hume's behalf.
Thank you. I see that Jackie is here. She could come inside.
Jackie!
Come inside, Jackie. Come on, ask your question yourself. In the meantime, you are impossible to control you, Jeff. Say something. Come
Okay.
on.
So I just
Jackie, enter the room, please.
I wanted to ask whether part of what's going on in your reaction to Don's talk about the value of humanity and your resistance to Jackie's focus on utility is a sense that in Hume, humanity is something we exercise, and we exercise our humanity via our sentiments towards others. And the worry is either talking too much about the value of it or about utility seems to objectify what most importantly is a way of being in the world, not a thing in the world that is that way. That's, as I was sort of grappling with what your resistance to both the use of the term value and the appeal to utility had in common, that's what I started to think. So I wonder if that's fits
I think
how you're
so.
thinking.
Yeah, I think so. I think that deviates a little bit from the way you describe, you interpret my resistance is, I think it is right. It's a resistance objectifying human beings, sentient beings, and um, to forget that they are sensible, sensitive, embodied, contingent, and all the good things that Hume brought into philosophy and that other philosophies left aside.
It's interesting to me because part of what Don is doing is trying to show that certain kinds of insights are not just Kant's, but Hume's too. And now, one thing to say is Kant had this insight that there's something wrong with objectifying people. And so part of what I'm getting from this is an important part of the story of what's so valuable about us should be
There she is.
based on how we engage with each other affectively. Hey, Jackie, I really enjoyed your
Hey,
talk.
I did too.
Okay, I'm going to mute
yes.
myself.
Only I don't need Kant's insights. You know, I want to maintain myself as far from him as possible. I think he is poisonous.
But can I just add to that? In a way, so there's a way in which Hume doesn't value human nature as such. He doesn't find it lovable or contemptible either. Rather, human nature has many endowments which are themselves valuable. It involves many faculties that are valuable. They are mostly instrumentally valuable in achieving other things that are intrinsically valuable. Things that are intrinsically valuable to us, which includes virtue, which is, although the passage was about pleasure and pain, virtue is intrinsically, we value it for its own sake and not just because of its utility. Many things we value for the utility, but and virtue too, but we value virtue for its own sake as we value beauty for its own sake and not merely for the pleasure that it gives us. So I think that's a sort of bracing thought. Actually, we don't love humanity as such. We are good company. We are the best company for each other. So there's a way in which human beings, as part of nature, are valued in the way that other things in nature are valued, which is the only way we can value them. But I also want to capture at the end the insight that is the sort of Kantian dignity of all humankind insight, that it is for us a virtue, and explained in the way that values of virtues are explained, to show respect to all human beings and to grant all human beings dignity. And that is itself a virtue for us, and hence of intrinsic value. And that still fits in his system.
Livia, may I ask a question?
Oh, please.
Oh, yes, please.
Thank you
You
so
are
much
here
for the-
to be part of this conversation.
Yes, hello everybody. Boa tarde. So thank you so much for that talk, Don. I also just want to flag that Professor Carlota has a question in the chat too that I'm really interested in hearing Don's answer to. But I just wanted to mention, Don, that I think you're exactly right about humanity as a whole, but the converse, or just to look at inhumanity, if you look at Hume's essay on the populousness of ancient nations, which is a kind of, political economy question about populations, but where he talks about ancient slavery and the inhumanity, he is eliciting our response to a past population of enslaved peoples who were so mistreated. And see, I'm getting emotional just talking about it, right? The kinds of things that were inscribed in the law about a way of treating other human beings. So that's one point. And the other, just going to your comment just now about dignity, that Hume has places, especially I think of in the inquiry, of course, in section 7, where he's talking about dignity for self. But what I wrote in the chat was in section 9 of the inquiry, when Hume is talking about what contributes to the force of our sense of humanity is the self-survey that we do. And so we're sort of internalizing the force of many sympathies. What he says there is, and that begets in noble natures a reverence for themselves and for others. And I just want to ask you, what would that reverence amount to in your view, and why noble natures is that where that is begotten?
Yeah, good, great. So first of all, yeah, great observation about inhumanity in the populousness of ancient nations, and the abhorrent inhumanity of slavery, and I admire Hume's ability to capture the sentimental response. Sentimental sounds like an inappropriate word there, but the emotional response, the sentiments, while sentiments are, as it were, typically calm, moral sentiments can rise to the level of the highest violence of response in just the way that a rapturous response to poetry can do. So thank you for flagging that. I also mentioned that humanity also applies to other sentient creatures. We could also feel indignation about the way that people other than human beings are treated, but we have so much more sympathy with human beings than with animals. On the reverence for ourselves, so noble natures are typically natures, I think you will agree, that exhibit a good deal of pride. That's what contributes to nobility of nature, a kind of due pride. So there are many causes of due pride, but the foremost among them is the virtue of one's own character, which one can survey. I take it that's what the reverence involves. The reverence is an absolute unwillingness to do something that might be for temporary advantage if it would damage one's own character, because that is what one values most about oneself, is one's character. That's what noble people do. That's what they value more than anything else. And we find that highly admirable, and we want to be that if we're not knaves, if we have that kind of character too. So I think that's what that reverence involves. It's not a reverence for our rational nature as such. It's a reverence for our virtue. The problem I'm saying classes, the problem with vicious people is not that they're irrational, it's that they're vicious people.
What is here? Jackie, do you want to reply to Dawn?
Oh, yeah, just very briefly. The reverence is also for others. It begets a reverence for ourselves and for others, which is a way of opening up another concept typically thought to be wholly Kantian, right? That idea of respect, a deep respect for other people.
That's right. That's what I was thinking of under the virtue of treating others with dignity, and I mean, not just treating them formally with dignity, but regarding them as having dignity. And that's nice that that connects up at the end of section 9, which I hadn't noticed. Thank you.
Jeff, do you want to reply to Jackie and to Dawn?
No, I just love the one thing is I'm trying to find the passage about reverence for noble people. It was reverence for noble.
It's in noble natures it begets
noble natures.
Self and other. It's 9, paragraph 10, like a few lines down.
Great. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
I love this. This back and forth about what we're capturing, how, and where the locus is, and to what extent it's worth salvaging or not, I think is really terrific.
Yeah. Olivia, can we take Carlotta's question?
Yes, now Carlotta is online.
Oh, great.
So Carlotta, can you show yourself to everyone, please? Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Carlotta, did you want to read your question?
Yes, I just wrote it. So I'm off the YouTube, so I'm looking for my questions.
Does anyone here have access?
Someone else who has it?
Because that's where the questions are in the chat. And once you're on Zoom.
You're not.
Yes, in Zoom we do not have access. Yes.
So I can read them.
Oh, good.
So she writes very nicely, "Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I have 2 questions. Here's the first. Why are passions and tastes not classified with sensibility in your classification? Where do we find the internal sense?" And then a second question is, does a positive response to the questions you presented imply that judgments are descriptive of a fact? Did I get the right 2 questions, Carlotta?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so thank you. Those are both great questions. So I did mean to include passion and sentiment in sensibility, but I went kind of quickly there. So sensibility typically defined starts from the ability to have sensation and other feelings, closely related to more modern term sentient. But what's of concern both to Hume and also to Kant when he talks about sensibility is less the sense perception aspect of it and more the internal passions, desires, and responsive sentiments like moral approval and aesthetic appeal. So that's where they are meant to go as elements of sensibility, and for our purposes, the most important elements of sensibility. So I do think that moral assessments, aesthetic assessments, state facts, that is, they are descriptive for Hume. Merely having a moral sentiment is not descriptive. That's just a feeling. An aesthetic response is just a feeling. That's not descriptive. But when we formulate an abstract idea as a concept, that involves correction of those sentiments by a generally approved standard perspective with standard endowments that we converge on as being the right perspective from which to judge these things, then you do get something descriptive. And you are, it's not that when you say something is virtuous, you are saying that it has a certain relation to a standard of judgment. You are that is semantically simple, but the way that the concept is structured is disputes about it is adjudicated by having a standard of judgment. That leaves out the you might say the expressive function of describing something as a virtue or describing something as beautiful also. So I take him to have a kind of hybrid semantic view. There's a descriptive aspect to that's just like colors also have a standard of judgment. The standard of judgment for blue is sunlight to a man in good health. That's a sort of very basic. Right? What's really blue is whatever looks blue to a man in sunlight if he's of good health or a person of good health. So but colors don't have any normative character. You're not praising something by saying that it's blue. But he's very clear that in calling something virtue, you are praising it. As he says at the beginning of the second inquiry, there are certain terms which are taken in a good sense. That means as I take it, that means they have an expressive function. It's part of the semantics of the term that you have made a mistake if you use that term without intending to praise it or encourage it in some way. And so there's that whole other aspect. And desirability is a more sort of open-ended, open to subject relativity, open to blameless disagreement concept than the sentiment-based ones like morality and aesthetics. But even that is descriptive. The case of virtue and beauty, we are expressing the character that we ourselves sign on to. If you're not part of the party of humankind against its common enemies, vice and disorder, you shouldn't really be using our language about this, because this is the language that we use who have these sentiments. And it's important for Hume that, a naturalist, that he explain why these concepts have normative force and like the color concepts don't. And that has to do with themselves, in many cases, being pleasures and pains, and in any case, in their having motivational force, just what Jackie was talking about, right? Their force has feelings and their motivational force. They structure the way we interact with each other, and they structure what we love people for and hate people for, and that whole the essentially social character of normativity, which Jackie's been so eloquent in describing. None of that was like in my talk, but Jackie said some of it. Anyway, that's how I think about it. Right? So, right, it is descriptive. It's not just descriptive.
But would you say that is descriptive of an internal personal fact, or is that descriptive of a fact about human nature? I didn't understand that.
Okay, so in saying that someone has a virtue, I'm describing someone about the person who has the virtue. I'm not describing my response to them. Similarly, calling something blue, I'm describing it. I'm not describing my response to it. Of course, I wouldn't describe it that way if I didn't have a response to it. And what determines whether I've had the right response to it or not is the sort of semantic character of the concept, which involves a standard of judgment. So I think, by not going on too long, Simon in his talk mentioned that in Hume you get this beauty is in the mind of the perceiver, but also beauty is in the beautiful object. Virtue is in the mind of the perceiver, but also virtue is a quality in a subject which causes us to love that person. Right? So he thought that was, I mean, Simon's view is that's sort of Hume being indifferent to the niceties involved. My view is actually he's following Locke, which I think Simon would agree with. I think Locke is more careful about colors than people think he is. His view is that the color terms are the names for sensations. Okay? But then there are powers in things which can be denominated from those terms. That is, those are the terms you also use to denominate the quality. Because what other term would you use? You don't know the actual inner structure of the thing which constitutes that power. So I think Hume just helps himself to that sort of systematically ambiguous treatment when he says that love is that virtue is a cause of love. He means a quality in the person. It is the power that it's something about the person, with the inner nature of which he has successfully identified as a scientist, usefulness and agreeableness to possessor or others. But he's also happy to say the other thing, which is that virtue is in the mind. But then, I mean, he's got an explanation of why we use it in both those senses. But I don't think he's actually confused about those two senses. But then I tend to
so either.
Hume on very, I always think Hume's right. Lots of times.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Muted.
So regarding the first question, what would be the difference between passions and tastes?
Okay. Yeah, so I see him distinguishing two faculties by the things they produce. The faculty that he just calls the passions produce passions. The faculty that he calls tastes produces sentiments. And those are the moral sentiments and the aesthetic sentiments. I should say he also has a broader sense of the term sentiment where it just means any feeling. And then it's very capacious, even include anything under that. But when he's distinguishing passions and sentiments, he means sentiments properly so called, which are the ones, those are the impressions of reflection. So these are two faculties that both produce impressions of reflection. But the passions is the faculty that produces the ones that are of a more violent type. That is, most of the tokens of the type are relatively violent, whereas taste is the one that produces impressions of reflection that are typically, in most of their tokens, calm, although they particular tokens can be violent. So he says that that's a sort of rough and ready distinction, but people distinguish it that way, and I'm going to distinguish it that way also, as what he calls mental geography, divvying up the various faculties and powers of the human mind. That's a natural, rough and ready, and sort of fine way to do it, because the ones that are typically violent do behave in ways that are quite different from the ways that the sentiments do. The sentiments being typically calm as they are, they need to acquire force from lots of us having the same ones at the same time. Whereas just a strong desire on my part, boy, that's super motivating, independently of being seconded by anybody else. But that is the distinction that I'm seeing: two faculties, passions and taste those sentiments, of which there's just moral ones and aesthetic ones, as far as I know. Well, actually, no, I think there are sentiments of wit and humor. There is also a sense of humor in Hume. So finding something funny, that is also an exercise of taste through having a sentiment.
But still kinds of impressions of reflection.
Yeah, they are all impressions of reflection. That's right.
Okay.
I think they together, passions and sentiments exhaust the impressions of reflection pretty much, except for maybe the impression of necessary connection and some other like feelings of internal operations of the mind or something like that.
It's confusing.
Yeah, thank you.
He makes it confusing, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
I'm always impressed that Hume wrote what he wrote without having a word processor. Like if he wanted to change the way he was going to express something, he had to go back and something in the margin or to do the whole page over again.
That's a good excuse.
That's a good excuse. Unfortunately, we don't have that excuse today.
Well, anybody wants to?
There's one, I've got a question
I
in the
posted
chat.
one from Mateus Mendez.
Okay.
Given Hume's naturalist account of values, would you say that knowledge in some sense is value sensitive? I mean, if value is a component of our daily beliefs. So I guess value comes in two ways. So one is that some of our beliefs are about value. So I said statements of value are descriptive, and hence you can believe them. You can believe that something is valuable. And in correcting your sentiments, sometimes you believe that something is desirable without actually desiring it. You judge that something is virtuous even though you don't feel any approbation for it. You believe that something is probable even though it doesn't feel probable to you. That's been happening a lot in the American elections. People judge that things are probable and yet they just don't feel that they are probable. So there's that. There are beliefs about value, but also I think that a belief's being true and it's being probably true are themselves matters of, that's to praise the beliefs, to say something good about them. We value the probability of truth and truth. And although Hume doesn't go very far along this line, except in the section about curiosity and love of truth, as a naturalist, he should explain why we prefer true beliefs to false beliefs and why we prefer having beliefs that we think are probable to having beliefs that we think are improbable. I do think he does have an explanation available for that. It's not that just as an a priori epistemological principle, you have a duty to believe true things and things that have a lot of evidence and a sort of a priori duty to disbelieve the others. There's a reason why we value the true ones and the probably true ones and disvalue the others. And that's to be explained along the same lines as why we value virtue and beauty. Okay, you are muted, Lydia.
How about thanking Don Garrett very much once again.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I thank you also? Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions and comments.
And inviting Professor Jeff Selwood to give us his talk entitled Hume's Robust Theory of Practical Reason. Thank you.
Can you all see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think the first thing I should say is, yes, I really mean it. His theory of practical reason. You can see why I see what I'm talking about as a natural follow-up to what Don was talking about. It's in the spirit of trying to reclaim for Hume the valuable parts of, for instance, Aristotle and Kant, which give a robust role to practical reason. Now, I have to admit, right from the get-go, he never uses the phrase practical reason. And he's very careful to sequester reason to a specific role and then argue that in that role, it alone has no impact. So I want to flag that I think the explanation for why he doesn't use the term at all is he was deeply committed to revealing the unfounded pretensions of people who appeal to reason as an all-purpose safe haven for their preferred views of theology, science, authority, or morality. And he thought people shove things under that halo of the term without justification. So if I were writing in his time, I wouldn't wheel out practical reason because it would be antithetical to what he was trying to do. On the other hand, I think people have gotten very wrong what Hume's actual view is and have missed the subtleties that gives him a very robust account of practical deliberation, decision, acting for reasons, acting for what we think are reasons, whether we're right or not about it. And that's what I'm interested in capturing. So I want to start just by acknowledging how far against the grain I'm going. The overwhelmingly dominant interpretations of Hume on practical reason are either that he's an utter skeptic or he's a very simple and direct instrumentalist. And it's not as if there's not tons of reasons for people to think these things. So just to pick out two relevant passages that people interpret as supporting skepticism, I mean, Hume says reason's perfectly inert, and it can't prevent or produce any action or affection. I mean, how clear can you get about reason just not being practical at all? And then another place he says, look, it's not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. If that's not contrary to reason, then whatever the story is of why we should or shouldn't do it can't have to do with reason or what it discovers. Similarly, there's plenty to support the idea that he was no skeptic. He was an instrumentalist. He thought reason was practical and it did have a role. In this first passage, he says, its role is to uncover false supposition and choose efficient means to our ends. Another place he says, of reason, it is and ought to be the slave of the passions. But what no one would deny that slaves are practical, that they accomplish things. It's just that they don't do it under their own guidance. So people say these passages and ones like them make indisputable that Hume thought reason was practical. It was just a servant of something else. Now, I think both of these views are wrong. Both of these views, I'll just note, need to have a view of what it would take to have a theory of practical reason. That they're either arguing he doesn't hold at all, or, that's the skeptics, or he does hold, but it's mere instrumentalism. So that's the setup for the paper. And I want to start by flagging what any serious theory of practical reason needs to have within it as an element. And I flag three. And about any of the three, I'm happy to go into more detail than I do here. But I want to give you the flavor of the overall account so we can have a good discussion about it. So let me start here. He thinks it's got to have within it some story, some account of the activity of practical reasoning. What's different about practical reasoning that sets it apart from just imagining things or wondering what would happen or reacting without thinking? What's this activity we're engaged in? I call it practical deliberation in the written version of this talk. The next thing you need is some account of what capacities one has to have in order to engage in this activity, so that you get a story of what kind of creatures are able to have practical reason. And then the third is some account of the standards to which those who engage in the activities, thanks to having the capacities, are subject. What are the standards of practical reason, assuming people engage in practical reason? So I'm going to take these in reverse order. I'm going to start, and here I'm really building on things that Jackie has put on the table and that Don also mentioned, especially in the questions section. So first, I'm just going to remind you, this group of Hume scholars, I'm going to remind you of Hume's account of the standards of practical reason. Before I do, I have to acknowledge it was not no stinking rationalist account. Hume is at great pains to argue that the rationalist accounts of the standards don't work for various reasons I won't go into here. He doesn't consider Kant's defense of the hypothetical imperative. Kant's defense of the hypothetical imperative is that it's an analytic truth, that insofar as reason has a decisive influence on one's will, one wills the necessary means to one's ends or abandons the end. Kant thinks that's analytic. Hume could agree that it's analytic. And if it's analytic, he would agree that reason alone can discover that analytic truth, but he would treat that analytic truth as a truth about which we then have the question of that concept of reason. What's that to us? What kind of authority does it have for us? You've just put on the table an idea of reason, you call reason, and said, oh, here's that idea. You don't count as rational if you don't take the necessary means to your ends. But that's not the defense of it as a standard for our behavior. So there's a lot to be said about his arguments against the rationalists, including how funny some of the arguments are. But let's go on. His account appeals to what he identifies as the general point of view. The thought is, and there's a strong analogy with color here, that we are in the world approving and disapproving of things, and we can raise the question of the things we approve of, which ones are approvable and which not. And he thinks the distinction between what's approvable and what's not approvable is found in the reactions of someone who takes up the general point of view. This is someone who reacts with approval or not, which is not a judgment, to what's being judged on the basis of its features, where the person knows the relevant features of the situation, the nature of the situation, the consequences of being the way the person in question is, if we're talking about approvability of people, and is impartial. So it's a matter of being informed and impartial and concerned so that you approve or disapprove accordingly. On Hume's view, this standard makes possible judgments of what's virtuous and vicious. And you might think, and again, we can get into the details of this, which are marvelous. You might think, okay, well, maybe that's his standard of virtue and vice, but that's morality. We're talking here about practical reason. So I want to just remind you that for Hume, explicitly, the scope of what he thinks about when he thinks about virtues include what he calls those features that make you personally meritorious. And he lists them: prudence, temperance, frugality, I misspelled it, industry, assiduity, enterprise, and dexterity. He goes to great lengths to capture not just what we think of as moral virtues, but other virtues of character that nowadays we count as the virtues of somebody who's practically wise. Okay, so against that background, I want to just highlight some features of the standards he thinks are set by those who take up the general point of view, which is a point of view any of us can take up in thought, whether or not we can take it up in feeling. We may not be able to disengage sympathetically from our interests or from the people we're judging even as we realize the extent to which our actual reactions would not be the reactions someone who was appropriately impartial and fully informed would have. We can worry about our own bias and think about what a correction would be. So let's think about those standards and notice that they do clearly take into account people's aims and desires. He thinks from the general point of view, we would be led to approve of things often precisely because those things satisfy people's desires or help them achieve their ends. But taking account of people's desires and aims is not the same as being answerable to them. He thinks you can't make sense even of the standards without recognizing that we are people who, in Livia's sense, humane. We're engaged with the world. Our feelings matter, but our feelings as they actually are don't settle what's virtuous, don't settle what meets the standard of practical rationality. Just to remind you, think of justice and benevolence, two moral virtues he thinks are genuinely virtues, precisely because they would secure approval from the general point of view. They both demand of people who have those virtues sometimes that they act in ways that they don't want to act in and that are even contrary to their interests. In much the same way, though, think about prudence. Here, too, people can want things that it's imprudent for them to want and imprudent for them to try to get. While prudence is more sensitive to the desires of the person being judged than justice and benevolence are, it's nonetheless a standard that allows the possibility that there are desires people have that they want to satisfy that they have no reason to satisfy at all. Because acting on the basis of the thought, this will satisfy this desire, gives you no reason to do it. This reminds me of the category that Socrates points out in the Republic of unnecessary desires. Desires people don't need to have, and they're not good for the person for them to satisfy them. These are things that Socrates thinks it's bad for the people to have, given that they could have avoided it. Think about drug addiction. And if they have the desires, it's bad for them to satisfy them from the point of view of prudence. Okay, so these standards, it emerges, set ends, things that we should do, should set ourselves to accomplish, whether we desire it or not. And these standards impose constraints on the pursuit of the ends we happen to have, or the desires we might try to fulfill. To my mind, this makes clear Hume, at least when it comes to the standards of practical reason, is not any kind of pure instrumentalist. He is not endorsing the idea that to the extent you desire doing something, you have a reason to do it. So I say, look at these standards, and at least when it comes to the standards, Hume's neither a skeptic about there being standards, nor an instrumentalist about what those standards are. Okay. I'm saying okay, not saying, oh, all wrapped up tight and put to rest, no discussion, but you get the sense of the position when it comes to the standards of practical rationality I'm finding in Hume. Let's move to the capacities, and you all can guess, he thinks there are two essential capacities. One is reason. Now, Hume's sense of what reason is borrowed directly from Locke, and it's the capacity to discover truth and falsehood on the basis of deductive and probabilistic reasoning. That's its entire scope. His arguments against rationalist foundations for morality depend on this restriction of reason. But it's not like he's cheating here. He's using a very prevalent and plausible and clearly articulated definition of what he means by reason. And he makes a lot out of the fact that this capacity to discover truth or falsehood can approve or contradict only what can be true or false. That's its exclusive domain. That's why reason is perfectly inert, that early quote. It cannot prevent or produce any action or affection, quote, by contradicting or approving it, close quote. It's a very important clause in the arguments he uses. It's in every instance of the argument against the practicality of reason, as you might think it is, except one. And importantly, because of all the people who would not a priori deny that one thing can cause another, Hume would be first and foremost to say, anything can cause anything, so long as we can discover without experience. His argument for the inertness of reason goes quickly and not by an appeal to cases or evidence or experience. It is an a priori argument. If reason can neither contradict nor approve of things that are neither true nor false, it can't cause them to do things by contradicting or approving them. This is also why, sorry, I combined two things I shouldn't have. This is also why preferring the destruction of the whole world to the destruction of my finger isn't contrary to reason. For that preference to be contrary to reason, it would have to be capable of being false. But preferences are not true or false. And again, it explains why reason cannot be the foundation of morality, because morality can prevent or produce action by contradicting or approving it. The terms of morality's approval and disapproval, contradiction, is virtuous and vicious, right or wrong, duty or against duty. Hume thinks when we judge of something that it's true, that doesn't contradict any preference we have. It doesn't contradict any action we might perform. When we judge that it's vicious, it does. And people are capable of being moved by the thought that what they'd be doing is vicious or virtuous. But there's no room to intelligibly judge of your action that it's false, or of your preference that it's false. Okay. But there's another essential capacity, according to Hume, sentiment. And this is, and there's a nice discussion of this already, between, Don was talking about types and tokens of feelings, whether they're things we're aware of and are vivacious or not. Sentiment consists in dispositions and tendencies we have to respond to our experiences and the contents of our minds. Important point. Although Hume has a very restrictive conception of reason, the two capacities he's picked out as essential to practical reasoning cover exactly the same ground that Kant's theory of practical reason covers. Once you recognize that in addition to being able to form the idea that something is our duty, Kant needs a story of what leads those people who have that idea to perform their duty and what's absent so that other people who form the very same idea fail to perform their duty. And he describes what's got to be there as reverence for the law. The big difference here between Hume and Kant are, first, Kant gives a single label to it, reverence for law. Hume is amorphous about which sentiments we need to have to be concerned with virtue and vice. That's the first thing. The second thing is Kant includes reverence for law as part of reason. It is, he thinks, an incentive of pure practical reason. And you don't have practical reason if you don't have reverence for law. Even if you could judge what accords and what doesn't accord with the categorical imperative. Hume takes the relevant sentiment, a concern for virtue, and puts it on the sentiment side rather than the reason side. But that's just a classificatory difference. They're really both saying something that you have to say if you allow that two people can make exactly the same judgment about what their duty is or what's virtuous, and one can then, as a result, do their duty or act virtuously, and the other won't. There has to be some other difference than what's involved in reaching the judgment. And they agree about that. So I think it's really important not to take Hume's recognition of the necessity of appeal to sentiment in explaining human action when they use reason as sufficient to show he doesn't have a theory of practical reason. Aristotle and Kant alike recognize the need for what Hume calls a sentiment in their account of those who are practically rational. Okay, the final third piece, how am I doing on time? Okay, a little less than half an hour so far. So, third element is to explain, now that we have the standards and the capacities, what is it to engage in practical reasoning? The first step is to have an account of things counting in favor or against taking certain options. It's one thing to be a kind of emotional push me pull ya, where there's temptation and you respond to it, or there's threat and you run to it. These are not cases where you're thinking of anything counting in favor or against. You're recognizing something and responding to it. Kind of a more or less complicated stimulus response agent. To be engaging in practical reasoning, you have to be able to be thinking of various considerations and having them weigh with you as considerations that count in favor or against doing something. So it's important to notice that in Hume, he distinguishes between mere desire and aversion and the indirect passions of approbation and disapprobation, which are modeled on love, hate, pride, and humility. The key, and this is in book 2 of the treatise, the really lovely aspect of introducing the indirect passions is that these are affective states we're in that are explained by the ideas we have of the things that secure these reactions. So when we approve of something, it's not just being attracted to it. When we disapprove of something, it's not just being repelled by it. It's recognizing it as having certain features in light of which we have these positive feelings of approbation or negative feelings of disapprobation. Now, that story doesn't work unless certain ideas are appealing to us and other ideas are not appealing to us. But if we ask of the person what her reasons are for approving or disapproving, the reasons she has are the considerations that are weighing for or against the thing that she approves of. The story an agent has of the approving of someone is she was kind to me, or she'd be helpful to my kids, or all these considerations that for that person weigh with her. So this now gives them the resources to, in canvassing our options, to be thinking about the features of our options, both comparatively and in prospect, and in whatever other terms weigh with us in favor or against things. So now you have the resources to be not just responding directly to a representation, but considering the features of things that weigh positively or negatively, or in more complex ways, as I write in the paper. Okay, so that gives him so I just want to flag. So if we're deliberating about things in light of their features, which weigh with us, they affect what we do only to the extent we are moved by what we approve of. And it's an interesting fact about Hume that he's very clear we don't always feel moved by what we approve of. So he recognizes the feeling of approval as competing with, or maybe not even engaging, motivations. You need to appeal to sentiment to explain when you do the very things you see as approvable. So let me go to the next step. Hume thinks, and this is the role of the general point of view in part, that we distinguish between what we happen to approve of and what's approvable. We recognize that we can approve of things that we ourselves think are not approvable. Or we can disapprove of things, have that feeling of disapproval, and think it's unfounded. The things we disapprove of aren't really disapprovable. And that thought is not just another approval or disapproval, it's the thought, were I fully informed and impartial and concerned with everyone who might be affected, I wouldn't approve of this. From that point of view, that's what makes it true, or that's what makes it that I'm thinking I approve, but it's not approvable. So now notice, if we think of acting for reasons as acting on considerations that do in fact weigh in favor or against our options, Hume has a story of doing that. But he recognizes that among the considerations that can and often do weigh with us are thoughts about what's virtuous or vicious, just or unjust, our duty or against duty. So he thinks it might be true of us. Sometimes we think that would be vicious, and that weighs with us against doing the act we otherwise might be tempted to do. But he can also distinguish between our thinking that a consideration rightly weighs and being right that it rightly weighs. So Hume, importantly, can allow that a lot of actually horrible things are done by people who do them in the name of duty or virtue. And unlike Kant, he doesn't valorize acting not just in accord with duty, but from duty. He's much more interested in acting on the basis of reasons, considerations that actually do count in favor of doing what you're doing, whether you think of them as your duty or not. But he can explain our capacity to act not just in accord with duty, but from duty, And that explanation goes from his equivalent of respect for the law. It's a concern for duty. It's just he's not always in favor of being like that. Because he thinks, unlike Kant, we can get way wrong what our duty really is. Okay, so with all that on board, we now have distinctions between being attracted or repelled by one's options and acting accordingly, approving or disapproving of those options in light of their features, where we are attracted to them or not and act accordingly, from thinking about which of the options are approvable or not approvable. Oh, thinking of whether options are approvable and not just approved of or not by us. Acting accordingly or not. As Hume notes, 'tis one thing to know virtue and another to conform the will to it. That conforming the will to our recognition that something is a duty depends on sentiment. But if we categorize things the way Kant does, that sentiment is something we have reason to have. It's in that sense a part of being rational. And whether we so act depends on whether we're concerned with what's approvable or not. And it's virtuous, he thinks, to be concerned with what's approvable, but not to fetishize it. So that's the sort of broad strokes picture that puts against complete skepticism and mere instrumentalism a set of aspects of Hume's view that I think mean he doesn't just have a wisp of a theory of practical reason. He has a very robust theory. It's naturalist, it's not rationalist, it's capable of recognizing our capacity to do our duty because we recognize it's our duty, but he doesn't think that's the way you have to be virtuous. And all of that is judged by appeal to the general point of view. So I think that's the end of the talk part of this.
Thank you. Glorious. Jeff,
Yes.
since I am almost alone in my stubborn position, I will do the unthinkable. I will throw to the wind all the rules of good manners, and I will be the first one to ask questions, because I ask my questions, which you do not have to answer. I think that you all will engage in a very profitable discussion about practical reason. And I'm not in that, I'm not taking that trip with you, not yet. Okay? So is that, guys?
So I'll just out of recognition for your humanity, emphasize that you can't help but take the trip with me because you thought carefully about which thing to do, and not just which you wanted to do, but which would be good to do. And being a virtuous person, you decide not to do what you thought would be vicious. So you're on this march with us.
Your name is gorgeous. Number one, Jeff.
Excuse me, Professor. Thank you for your presentation. Please, could you stop sharing your screen in order to a full screen in YouTube? Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Great. Number one, Jeff. In the treatise, Hume says general points, plural, of view. And something very important, because when you take general points of view, you are able to move from particular to particular scenarios in which you do not you not place yourself as an impartial observer, but as a partial observer, not endowed with your self-interest, but with the interests of the persons who suffer pleasure or pain from the actions of those around them. So there is no impartiality, and the scenarios are various. There is not one general point of view. So I think Hume is not, this is very important, because constant practice and the constant exercise of moral experience of sympathy and enlarging of sympathy. Number two, I think that when you...
Would it be all right for me to answer that before going to number two?
No, I prefer that you take all of it, because then you choose.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Number two, remember, Hume in the second inquiry, he is very clear when he says that virtue is a word with very different meanings in different cultures. So it is narrow, more narrowly understood in modernity, but natural qualities of the mind are considered virtues in other cultures, and he's well disposed to side with the ancients. So there is nothing exceptional in taking qualities of personal merit to be virtues for him. And remember, virtues are mental qualities, very culturally sensitive, and when he makes the list of useful and agreeable to self and others, his lists are crazy, because one thing that he says, one quality that he says is agreeable to self, might very well be placed in useful to others. So it's very interchangeable, everything that he says. Now, when you move the emphasis to ends and desires, virtues disappear completely. Desires, I think, have such an appeal to us nowadays because of, I believe, it occurred to me right now, because of the hyper activation of desires by means of the consumer society. In Hume's time, he speaks of desires in the influencing mode of the will. And reason would enter there in the beliefs, in the influencing motives of the will. And if you want to study the influence of reason, you would have to see that section and probably the behavior of characters in the history of England. That's the place to go. And ants are are, are so far from our current concerns. There is no kingdom of ants in Hume's account of humans' dispositions. The most he gets close to ants is when in my own life his ruling passion, which is the love of fame. His ruling passion, the love of fame, is the closest he gets to an end that is far away in his view of his conduct in his life. So I do think that ends and desire is taken far away from a Humean, an orthodox Humean view, which sees human beings company, agreeable or disagreeable, approved or disapproved, and fixes your attention in humans thoughtfully, consciously, deliberately, judgingly, considering their actions, their behavior. This is not companionability. This is to be aware, to be conscious. And I do think that one of the best contributions that Hume gives to philosophy is to take us far away from philosophy of conscience. He shows how much our mental processes do not happen by conscious processes, automatic, how memories come and go, how by inclination, by disposition, to be aware of everything that happens in our minds is not what Hume shows us. And your agent and your moral agent is conscious, constantly aware, constantly deliberating, kind of moral machine, implacable, sometimes it seems to me, which is kind of scary. So, there are dangers in this view, I think. And I also think that, remember, duty is the dislikes. He says, these moral philosophies of duty, deontological, are a kind of improper influence of theology in moral theories. Theologians are getting power over moral thought and creating systems of duty. Morals is not duty. So I do think that I have to learn your philosophy, but I think there are dangers in it, because this moral agent may become someone that is very judgmental and not more than judging, and a human person is not judgmental. But I love your construct of everything, and I do think that I'm just in awe and a little bit scared because the name of Kant freaks me out. Sorry, I will study and I'll be a better person for it. Thank you.
So there's very little that I disagree with you about in what you said, though I'm a little struck by some of the things you think I think. So
Because I'm crazy. I'm mad.
no, I know you're not. I know it's a problem of my being clear about some things. But let's start where you started. Hume does definitely once talk about general points of view, plural.
Right.
Okay. And I have no problem with that. My much more complicated view of the general point of view, and I have this paper called The Bauhaus Theory of Ethics, says,
oh, yes, I love that.
So what's going on? What you've pointed to is, hold it, Jeff, if you think there's just one sharp, focused, inaccessible to the wrong kind of people point of view, because you have to be a perfectly impartial, fully informed spectator, I don't think that's Hume's view at all. I think Hume thinks the particular virtues are solutions, collective solutions to salient shared problems. And I think he thinks the general point of view is labeled that way, the same thing. But notice, just as context can change so that what's a shared salient problem for us wouldn't be a shared salient problem in other cultures, so too how you construct the general point of view, that is, get a shared standard of judgment to regulate and sort through our reactions, that's the view I'm attributing to Hume. I think the arguments that he uses to put into place each aspect of the general point of view commits him to more univocity than you might think. But I think that's a different issue. All I'm really trying to convince you of is Hume thinks there's an important difference between approving of something and thinking it approvable, of being attracted to something and thinking you have reason to do it. And I say this difference, this distinction is funded by this standard, vaguely gestured at in this talk, compatible with variation across cultures and times, as also it's compatible with different character traits being virtues in different communities. So that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing I want to say is, I think you misunderstood me about virtues. I mean, your second point is, especially in the inquiry, he says, look, virtue is just a word, and if you look broadly, there's no important distinction between what people nowadays in his day are calling moral virtues and other things. He says this is just a verbal dispute. I completely agree with him. I tried in my paper to use that point and to highlight the fact that he thinks of prudence as a virtue. And sort of specifically beneficial to the possessor virtue. But with you, being surrounded by prudent people is a huge benefit to us too. The imprudent people bring us all down fast in a storm. So the category useful or agreeable to self or others are not exclusive categories. They're different accounts of what makes this character trait a virtue. So I think you got the impression somehow I was castigating Hume for having too narrow a view of virtue, whereas in fact I was saying, look, his account of the standard of virtues is self-consciously in Hume an account of
My bad.
Okay. Then the third thing, I tried, but very lightly at the end, to flag how important it is that Hume does not valorize people who always only do what they judge to be their duty. That's not Hume's view of what a virtuous person is like. At the same time, he thinks people do sometimes do that, act the way they act because they think it's their duty or their obligation of justice. And so what I tried to lay out too quickly is instrumentalists seem to think, so I'm leaving aside the skeptics right now, that all practical reasoning is finding yourself, and I was trying to use purposely vague, not specifically Humean phrases here, with an end or a goal or a desire or an urge. Instrumentalists say, oh, here's what's going on for reason. I really want that. And you say, how can I get it efficiently? And that's the end of the story. I think that's a parody of human deliberation. And the first step is often we find ourselves not wanting to do much of anything, let's say. And then we realize, oh, but if I did that, it would really help Marcos. And being a person who's moved by the thought of helping people, this thought, this would really help Marcos, is a consideration that weighs in favor of my helping Marcos. So the first thing Hume does is allow us through his indirect passions to have potentially motivating states, sensitive to our sentience, our engagement with others, but that's always mediated by ideas, thoughts about what the features are of the options or the actions. But now I can be moved to help Marcos. And then I can realize, yeah, I was right. It really would help him in the way I was thinking. But helping him in this way will make him a target of his neighbors. And then I think, oh, so I was approving of helping him, but should I help him? Given that, oh no, I shouldn't, but I want to. We've all been in this situation where we really feel like doing something. We'd feel good about doing it. And then we think, for the sake of my kids or my friends or whatever, I shouldn't do it. Now, I think Hume thinks we can do that. And then we can worry, okay, we've now got this possibility to be moved by considerations and then to worry about the approvals. Are they approvable? Okay. And that lets us have the idea, this is worth doing. It's approvable to do. Okay. And I think Hume thinks sometimes we think in those ways when we shouldn't. Sometimes we shouldn't be worrying constantly, is this approvable? And other times we should be. And my account was not saddling Hume with the Kantian fetishization of acting from duty and not just within accord with duty, but trying to give Hume the resources to notice how kids develop into beings who are thinking about their options and in light of their ideas of the options, choosing among them, first by what's most appealing, and then by a sort of regulated willingness to go by their own appeal. And I think Hume thinks that's just a human trait that he better explain, and book 2 is given over to a lot of that. And I think there are dangers in the view. If you end up thinking, I think Hume thinks we should all fetishize duty or obligation or virtue. He doesn't think any of those is the idea on the basis of which we should always be acting. Because from the general point of view, we wouldn't approve of people who act in that way.
Thank you. I'm very happy now. I'm happy again.
Oh, well, I'm concerned to make you happy. I thought, let me flag one other thing you put on the table that I think is really important. From the general point of view, we're thinking about the impact of people's character on those in what he calls the narrow circle. And it's a really lovely thing about his account that who the narrow circle is depends partly on what trait we're thinking of the person in question. So the relevant narrow circle for parents are basically their kids and their partners. For business leaders, their society and their business with priority to one with approved partialities all across the board here. With government leaders, the whole country, so it's very important that Hume thinks it's not just our thinking about whoever happens to be nearby, the narrow circle. Okay, so are there other questions? Carlotta.
Carlotta. Please.
Professor, thank you very much for the talk. My question is, would you consider that the possibility of being wrong about what our duty is commit Hume to admit a revisionist feature in his theory, in the sense presented in the section of the treatise of skepticism with regard to reason, that somehow our reasonings concerning moral facts can be replaced by other, more refined reasonings? Tá mudo.
I think his mic is muted.
Yeah, that's a very nice question. Sorry. I think it's important not to too quickly start with talk about moral facts when you're thinking about Hume. I do think in all the ways we can well fund, he thinks they're moral facts, but he thinks they're moral facts because we have concepts that, given the way the world is, apply to the world, and they're moral concepts like virtue and vice. I think he thinks he's committed to thinking both his own account of what we're like at the time he's talking about us is revisable. He could have used the wrong concepts. He could have been too beholden to talk about virtue where he should talk about something else, or vice versa. And I think he thinks, but this is part of the whole Bauhaus view, he could come to the view that, oh, that was fine at a time, but now that we have other tools and resources, by our own lights, we should change the way we think of things. So just for those who don't know this paper, the point of the Bauhaus theory paper is the slogan of the Bauhaus School of Architecture is form should follow function. So to understand a good design, you have to figure out what the design problem is. What do humans really need? I think that's basically Hume's view of why we've introduced virtue and vice, is we need to think together about which traits solve the design problem of addressing shared problems that are salient to all of us. And I think he thinks we could change. We could become, different in all sorts of ways that shape what problems we have, or that shape what resources we have to solve the problem. That won't have made old designs, good designs for when they will solve those problems, but they could make them completely obsolete or unavailable to us. So I think there's a lot of room for not fixating on particular things. I mean, in the paper, I talk about the extent to which the virtue of benevolence depends on our needing each other's help and on our attempts to help, not actually hurting each other. He would think the road to hell is paved with good intentions if he thought we were. Do you guys know Dr. Magoo? He's a cartoon character who everything he does, he bumbles completely. So you can imagine a benevolent Mr. Magoo who every time he tries to help, he ruins people's lives. If everybody was like that, Hume would say, don't try to help people. That's a vice. Here's why. So is that speaking to your question?
Yes, but in that case, were we really wrong in the first place?
How so? Wrong about?
About what our duty is.
Oh, I think he thinks a lot of people are very wrong. As Livia was pointing out, he's got this category of the monkish virtues, which he thinks people do think are virtues, but they're just completely wrong. So he needs to both explain what's going on in their head so that it counts as them thinking it's their virtue, a virtue, and explain why they're wrong about it being a virtue. And that's one of the kinds of cases that I think makes Hume really committed to saying, don't think all of a sudden because you're doing what you think is virtuous, you're being virtuous. That's just not true. He thinks too much evil's been done in the name of righteousness. So that's the danger. I think he's very sensitive to that danger that Livia was posting.
Okay, thank you.
Jackie, one question before you ask. Before you ask, we received the chat a question from Marcelo Oliveira. Congratulations, Sayre-McCord. Concerning the first definitions, skepticism seems to reach even instrumentalism. Concerning duty, it seems in the treatise, book 3, there is a choice between assent or not to it. Oh,
Now I'm unmuted.
microphone.
Okay, got it.
Did you understand?
I'm not sure. So I'll take the first part, and Marcello, please chat with us to let me know if I'm misunderstanding this. The first part is, if you have a skeptical interpretation of Hume, then that includes being skeptical about his being an instrumentalist. And I think that's right. I think skeptics think there's something that has to be in place that makes you count as engaging in practical reasoning, and people don't have it. And I think the skeptical interpretation is usually, so Gene Hampton is like this, he doesn't really think there are any standards of reasoning. There's instrumental calculations, but for him, that's not a standard. And so he doesn't really count as having a theory of practical reason. So she has a view of what a theory of practical reason has to have in it, a standard, and argues Hume doesn't have such a thing. So I think those who interpret Hume as a skeptic think, in general, the instrumentalist interpretation is wrong of him as an account of practical reason. The instrumentalists think that's wrong. He does have a standard. It's a very simple standard. It's well articulated. You've screwed up if you haven't thought appropriately about your ends. You don't understand what you're trying to achieve, or you don't understand what it takes to achieve it. So that first part of the question, I think I understood. And that's how I'd answer it. The second part, I didn't quite get. Can you maybe
Well,
rephrase it, or?
he he is arguing. It's an observation. He notes that in Book 3 of the treatise, Hume uh, asserts that we have a choice between assenting or following our duties or not. That's what I think he said. Is that it?
Can you see the chat? If that's it, I'm trying to explain why that's true for Hume. So first, you have to have an agent. For someone to assent or not to what they think is their duty, they have to be able to think it's their duty.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to explain how that works in Hume, in a way that leaves it true that it's an open question whether a person who thinks it's her duty does her duty. And that's why it's a little bit important to me that thinking something's your duty is not, as some early emotivist interpretations of Hume would have it, being super duper moved to do it. Otherwise, you don't really think it's your duty. I think that's a misunderstanding. I think,
or some Kantians would think,
well,
knowing your duty is being moved to.
if you have reverence for the law,
Yeah.
because they grant that there are evil people who don't do what they recognize their duty is. So when you say their idea is, or this is highly controversial. My idea of what's going on is Kant's emphatic that this kind of idea engages us. So it's not as if the reverence for the law is caused by a separate desire of some sort. It's rather caused by the idea of the law, that if we pay attention, if we're decent people, reverence wells up in us. But he grants it doesn't really well up in everybody.
Well, he adds, it seems that since duty is a feeling, there is
Não,
no
não, Lívia.
ontology.
Sorry, só isso daí é a repetição. Embaixo, a última parte está escrito he completes.
Exato. Well,
Well,
it seems that since
okay.
duty is a feeling, there is no ontology concerning it. I
Okay.
mean, naturally, human beings are animals out of duty, or not, not out of duty. I don't think the English is very perfect, but are animals not called by duty.
Right. So I don't want to fall over the use of duty here too much. I mean,
Okay.
But Hume, as I understand Hume, when he's trying to explain the obligation of justice, and he wants to avoid the circle argument, and what he's doing is he's recognizing that we have an idea, and he's trying to figure out what in the world that is an idea of and how he can make sense of it. And that starts with the idea that we're not born with the idea of duty.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a project that leaves him wanting it to be possible that the sensible knave recognizes it's his duty and just doesn't care. And the way you do that is by making sure the idea of duty is not just a feeling. Because if you think the idea is duty is just a feeling, then you can't both think the person has the idea and think they don't care about it. Same with approvability. If you think approvability is thinking something's approvable is just approving of it, you can't make sense of thinking it's approvable and then still not approving it. can't bring yourself to approve it because it's your enemy and sort of thing.
Okay. Guys, we have 2 more questions. We have time for 2 more questions. One of them is Jackie Taylor's question. And then we have a question also by Don Garrett. But it can take as long as you wish, because we look forward to see the 3 of you in very lively discussion. Thank you.
Before Jackie asks her question, I just want to say what I know is true of the 3 of us, and Simon and of Angie. We would love to have you see us together with you in person, walking around Dino Team, or walking around Bello, or Ocherius, or wherever. I think we all so miss the great pleasures we've had with the Hume group.
Guys, you, and we miss you so, so much. Thank you. But now,
Jackie.
for the conversation.
Here, Jeff. Thank you for that paper. That is just splendid. And I really appreciate the way in which you made those distinctions, the number of distinctions there. I'm just going to offer one additional piece of text as an answer to Carlotta, which is towards the end of section 2 of the inquiry concerning the principles of morals, where Hume notes that when certain practices that we have stop working in the way we intended them to, we adjust our moral boundaries anew. And he gives 2 different kinds, he gives several kinds of cases, but one concerns charity, charitable giving on the street he's thinking about when that stops working. But the other interesting one is tyrannicide, because yes, that was the only option, right? For deposing a bad leader back in
killing Tyrannosauruses.
Back in ancient times, but we have other ways, we hope, of deposing a bad leader. So just an interesting passage. But I also want to just look at another passage with you, which is in the first appendix of the inquiry, because it's a really interesting example that I think speaks to Livia's worry. And it also contains a lot of vocabulary that you are interested in: moral deliberation, moral decision, and moral choice. So it's, which copy do you have there, Jeff?
Selby Big.
Okay, so it's, well, if you go to the first appendix, and Hume starts enumerating things. So it's a paragraph that has a number 2, when a man at any time.
Oh, I know where you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, so this one is so interesting. Look at his example. When a man at any time deliberates concerning his own conduct, as whether he had better, in a particular emergency, assist a brother or a benefactor. Well, then he goes on to like all the kind of reasoning that must ensue: my relation to each, the circumstances of each, my own circumstance, the situations. And he says to determine the superior duty and obligation. So there he's got both duty and obligation. But I would think that this would be difficult to map onto something like Kantian imperfect duty. I'm helping somebody, and it's easy to see how I could go wrong in either case. I want to stay in the good graces of my benefactor, or I don't want to incur the disapproval of my family. And those would both be bad reasons in your sense of, right, approving of my reasons for action here. But this seems to be really, it's, what is it to work through this and to come up with the answer of who to assist in this emergency? I think that it's a lovely example for the way in which you've set this out, because it's not, you could go wrong, but really you're stuck, right? You're in a kind of dilemma. Who do I help? I can only help one. Yeah. So do you have any thoughts about that?
So I love this passage because it's one of the really robust examples of Hume seeing us as weighing considerations that we recognize pull in different directions, and seeing ourselves as trying to settle, so which is the right one to take. a nice thing about Hume, so Kant famously denies the possibility of moral dilemmas. So he says a conflict of duties is inconceivable because that would be a conflict between two opposing necessities. There is only ever a conflict among the grounds of duty. So he wants to say considerations can conflict, but it doesn't mean that no matter what you do, you're acting contrary to duty. Hume doesn't set things up that way. He does a couple of things. One thing, if I'm right, the general point, not every problem we face is a shared salient problem to which the general point of view can be brought to bear. Career choices, future of my career versus my family, within certain domains, Hume thinks they're really important things to think about, and you're a fool if you don't think about them. But that's not the same as saying, and you screwed up if you gave more weight to your family than to your career, or vice versa. So he's not committed to what utilitarians are. Tote up all the considerations, give them a weight, and either they come out equal or one outweighs the other. That's not part of Hume's repertoire, as I understand it. And I think it's a huge plus for Hume. Not all practical problems of practical deliberation have a right answer. Doesn't mean you can't mess up by not thinking about the important things, but it means you can't mess up in the sense of having made the wrong choice within a set of choices. The other thing I like is the things that are pointed to in this deliberation. The second book of the treatise explains why those are weighing with this person. And for another person who doesn't care about their benefactor or doesn't care about the family, why it just wouldn't matter to them that this would be the effect. So this is one of the passages I thought helps make the case Hume really did think about thinking about what to do. It's one of the few almost first personal passages rather than third personal. So it's not judging of another, it's trying to decide what the hell to do. But it's really lovely for the reasons you say.
Yeah, if I could just add too, I think, right, it's also not Kantian because I'm not trying to figure out, right, who to help in the sense of really a duty from reason. But Hume's, the main point I think of the passage is once reason has done all its work in considering relations and circumstances, it's up to the heart to weigh in. And that does not have to be an easy choice at all, right? That can be a mingling of regret with the desire to help and so on.
Yeah, although I would push back just a little bit. I mean, I think you're completely right. Hume thinks there's just a whole range of things where duty and obligation just are not the issue. I also think he thinks where they are the issue, it's not always true that what a virtuous person would do is her duty or the just thing. He hasn't organized these concepts in a way that makes one take priority over the other always. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think it goes too quickly. So in this case, and many cases, he does think it's a matter of the heart. That's right. You've run out of reasons, and make yourself the kind of person you're going to be. But I think that can tempt you into the thought that he thinks the bottom line is, once you've exhausted the relations and stuff, go with your heart. But he thinks some people's hearts are black or not sufficiently involved, and they're condemnable for it. So he still thinks there are cases where if you say, okay, on the one hand, I could slit his throat, but if I slit his throat, I'm not going to get to slit his throat. But I'll make more money if I slit his throat, but I'll make more friends if I slit his throat. Oh God, I can't decide. I'll go with my heart. Hume thinks, whoa, 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 no matter which of those you do, it's wrong if you can restrain yourself. So I just want to make clear, I think the fundamental standard for Hume is not your heart. The fundamental standard explains why you have to consider all these things and not other things, and why sometimes those run out.
Yeah, I think he really means sentiment, not heart. Right?
Yeah.
What's the approvable?
Approvable is
Is Jeff frozen?
I think he is.
Coming back. Maybe.
Jeff?
yes, I'm back.
Oh, thank God. You were invisible for a moment.
My Wi-Fi went down all of a sudden, so I had to go in and try to figure out what went wrong. I'm sorry. Don, did you have a question?
Yes. By the way, one of your many lovable qualities is your ability to totally freeze and not move at all for like 20 seconds and then to disappear. I just don't know anybody else who can do that the way that you can. So the question I wanted to ask you about was how to think on Hume's behalf about desires that you have no reason to satisfy. So, and this may be a question to which there's no determinate answer, but here are a couple of options. So the way I think about desirability and desiring is that if you desire something, then you've got a defeasible pro tanto reason why it's desirable, or it is. And that's a kind of that's parallel to his view about subjective evidence as a kind of phenomenal conservatism. If something is subjectively evident to me, then I have a defeasible reason, or I have defeasible justification to believe it. But of course, that might be defeated. It's defeasible. But that explains why he can reject antecedent skepticism. He has no we have no obligation to establish the reliability of our faculties before we start believing things. It's only when we find through science and inquiry that there is some problem with our beliefs, with our faculties, that we stop assenting to them. So I'm inclined to think that's also how moral evidence works. If I've got moral sentiments, I don't have to first establish the reliability of my moral sentiments. So far, I've got some reason to make a moral judgment, but it might be defeasible. And similarly with judgments about external objects. So that kind of sort of cognitive conservatism here. If I desire something, then defeasibly, I have some reason to regard it as desirable. And it's only by correction that I would reject its desirability or withdraw the claim that it's desirable. So one way of thinking of desires that you have no reason to satisfy would be, although you did originally have some reason to think they were desirable, those reasons were defeated. So in fact, it's not desirable, even though in a sense you had a reason to to think it was desirable based on your desiring it, but now just as, that was an illusion in the desert I saw. I thought I had a reason to believe it, but I don't. Another way to think about it would be, now I do have a reason to regard it as desirable, although that reason may be defeated or not. But that's a separate question from the question whether I have a reason to do it or a reason to pursue it. So I might have some reason to think it's desirable, but it's still a step from something's being desirable to it's being something that I have a reason to do. There's some further tests beyond desirability. That's a test of practical reason that has to get passed. So as I say, he says some things about desirability and its relation to desires. I'm not sure whether it's enough. It may be that there are two slightly different conceptions of practical reasoning here and having a reason to do something. But anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on how to think about the relationship between the desirable and what we have reason to do and how they both relate to having a desire. Like scratching my little finger. I have a desire to do it. Does that make it desirable? Does that give me a reason to do it, even if it is desirable?
So let me start at the end with that example. So I made a big deal about reason's role is to discover truth and falsehood, and that's the limit of its domain. And that's why the preference for one over the other isn't contrary to reason. It's because the preference isn't true or false. But we can ask of that preference, is it wrong or bad or vicious? That can be true or false, and reason can discover that, on Hume's view, by, in effect, and Don said something really relevant here about how the concept works, by checking whether it would secure approval from the general point of view, or the relevant general point of view, if we're imagining multiples. So, against that background, we take the fact of beings who have desires. My dog, she wants me to let her out. Me, I want to keep talking philosophy. And now we can ask a question about these beings. Do they have reason to do what they desire to do? That's a question formulated using a concept, as I'm thinking about it. And that's the question of, would people acting on the recognition that they desire it be approved of from the general point of view? And there's different possibilities. One answer would be yes, unless they have contrary evidence. Or yes, unless it's this kind of desire. Or yes, unless God disapproves of it. And these are slightly different possible standards for it's being approvable to take your desiring something as the desiring of something as a consideration that counts in favor. That's what it is for it to play the role of a reason. And for it to be a reason is for it to garner the appropriate approval. I find myself, so this is not Hume right now. I'm a fan in theories of justification of what I call permissive justification, which, so I'm anti-foundationalist. I don't think you start with things that you have reason to hold, or start with things that have reason to offer just in virtue of the particular kind of thing it is. But I think if a belief comes on the table, so to speak, or a desire comes on the table, and there are no considerations you have that count against, it's weighing with you as a reason for something else, then you perfectly permissibly go to the conclusion. Whether the conclusion is I desire it, or the conclusion is it's justified or believable. But all of those moves are highly sensitive to what the right standards are, and there's a real debate about it. In Hume, I think you've nailed, I think the way those arguments work is there's no complaint about our doing these things. So no responsibility to try to meet some job I don't have. That's compatible with being convinced in particular cases of a skeptical challenge or of a undesirability of what you desire. I mean, what jumped to mind when you started was the view that we're all born evil, and our appetites are, our animal instincts are base. If you held that view, then you'd have reason to think everything I want is for what's not desirable. Now, only because you had this view, but I think if you had this view, you really would have reason to think, oh, I want to do this, there must be something wrong with doing it. Now, with Livia, I think it's a completely corrupt, disapprovable, false view of the world, but I don't think the people who are born into it are being irrational for worrying that their desire for pleasure is a bad thing, and so they shouldn't satisfy it. I think that's intelligible. Does that speak to it a little bit?
Yes, exactly. I think there is a kind of semantic connection between desiring something and finding it to be, judging it to be desirable when that's considered from a certain perspective. So in that sense, it is desirable if from the sort of standpoint for correcting desirability, it is undefeated. Then there's the further question of from assessing actions and assessing the character of things that are desirable, whether they pass the test of, as it were, reasonableness for action.
Right.
And since it does, since we're not evil,
right,
everything is, as it were, in good order there. Can I just add on reason as a capacity to discover truth or falsehood? So I think Hume does believe that it is a capacity to discover truth and falsehood. And so it's fair to characterize it that way, but it's like characterizing the senses as a capacity to discover the existence of external objects. So thinking of it as just an analysis of meaning would have you say that if the skeptics were to turn out to be right about the imbecility of our reason, then really we wouldn't have reason because it wouldn't be discussing truth and falsehood. So it can be on the table whether reason, this operation, which we believe is a capacity to discover truth and falsehood and naturally leads us to think that certain things are truth or false, does in fact discover it in the way that defining the senses as the capacity to be aware of external objects doesn't leave room for the question of whether our senses actually inform us of the existence of external objects.
Yeah, so I think that's absolutely right. I think it shouldn't be read as a success term.
Mm-hmm.
And the role I try to give to it in the paper is there are all these people who talk about the inertness of reason. And I've always been struck by how Hume was explicit about anything can cause anything so far as the ideas go.
Mm-hmm.
And but when you read this extra clause that I brought to people's attention, all of a sudden it turns out to be an analytic truth. I can't, if I can't discover you're false, I can't cause you to do something by discovering you're false. That's just not in the offing. But all of that is compatible with saying, and I can't discover whether you're false, period, because there's no falsity here. So I think that's right. The other thing that I play with in the written draft of this paper is when you think of reason, it's really a theoretically practical thing. That is, it moves you from considerations to beliefs. And here's one thing that's true: just recognizing the connections among the ideas doesn't get you to belief. He needs a story that both explains bothering to think about things and believing the conclusions. And that's going to be a story that includes, in effect, sentiments. Do we care about what the truth is? We know certain people who seem not to govern their beliefs by the truth. They certainly don't govern what they say by the truth. But so I found it kind of interesting that there's the capacities pointing to as reason itself has both the judging true or false, whether accurately or not, and that's got to be motivated, and it's a process you go through. And Hume has an explanation of that he does pack into reason. So using your reason is a matter of caring about truth. The way for Kant, using your practical reason is carrying about what you have reason to do. And that's a fine way to do it. And Hume does it in the first place and doesn't do it in the second place.
Yeah. So I could say I tend to think Hume is a better cognitive psychologist on this front and does the mental geography a little better than Kant does. But I also want to emphasize, we're coming back to animals. So animals do have reason, as we know, from several sections. I don't think they care about truth, because at least truth in the sense in which Hume defines it as correspondence between your ideas and how things are, because they don't form reflective ideas of that, second order ideas of that kind, and so they don't have a concept of truth, and so they don't care about truth. Human beings who do have a concept of truth do care about truth when they reason, but it's not essential to having reason as the inferential capacity to care about truth.
No, I think that's right. I think whether you use your reason, for a lot of people, depends on their caring what the truth is. That's really the thing I was thinking about. So for things like dogs, it's important to his story, I think, that they have representations of the world that are true or false. And
as it were, they care about what is the case.
Yes.
They just don't care whether their beliefs are true, because they don't ever
Exactly.
think about whether their beliefs are true.
Right. And I think that's because they don't have the concept of truth.
I agree.
They don't need the concept of truth, but they need the resources that make our concept of truth applicable to them.
Yes.
If they were just unguided by their representations or guided in a way that's not sensitive to their evidence that that's the way the world is, then we would not think of them as having reason.
I agree.
Yeah. Coolio. Now you guys have all been doing philosophy all day long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
What
Been
a
wonderful. Gosh, we miss you guys so very much. It's been wonderful.
Yeah.
I miss you too.
We completely miss you. And it's a pleasure to meet the new people we'd not met
Yes.
before.
We will
Yes,
start missing you now.
Where's Anise and Bruno?
they disappeared because they have Pedro to take off now. Little Pedro.
God.
Gosh.
There we go.
But you know, Alana is doing her doctorate on the history of England.
The whole history of England?
I don't know. We'll see.
So when I was in graduate school, we were required to take courses or exams on historical features. I think we had to do 3 or 4. And I decided I would do Hume not as a course, but you had to do 1 exam at least. So I spent a fantastic summer in a small barn near the ocean with a coffee pot and everything Hume wrote, and all the secondary literature I could find. It's one of my happiest times in my life. And my dad gave me the whole history of England, and in the note that came with it was, race you. And so we we read through the whole thing. one volume at a time, trying to beat each other and then argue about it. And it was just so fun.
It is. It's wonderful.
It was just so, that's a magnificent accomplishment.
Yeah.
So, very good thing to spend time thinking through. But do it near the ocean with some coffee.
Jackie, there's a tail waving in front of you. I think.
Yes, it's a little cat, a beautiful
It's
cat.
not mine.
Oh, it's not yours.
No!
It's my cat, and she believes it's true that it's time for lunch for her.
Oh, look at Elena's cat. How cute.
Do you know that scene from one of the Pink Panther movies where Inspector Clouseau is asked if his monkey bites? And he says, "My minky does not bite." and then the guy gets bitten by a monkey, and he says, "Thought you said your monkey did not bite." And he says, "That is not my minky."
My cat's name is Addison. She's named after Joseph Addison and the Pleasures.
Joseph!
Wow.
So right now she's batting around. She's managed to knock something off a shelf and she's batting it around. It could be a mouse, but it's not.
Okay.
It's not. Cool.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful occasion. This has been so inspiring. I'm so happy. I think Alana will send me her paper because it was at 3:30 in the morning when she was delivering it. 3:30 here.
Oh, Alana, Vinícius França, Vinícius Souza, Ademir. Ademir is not showing. He's Grupo Hume. There he is. And they did all the work. They really knew the strength beyond behind this event. Ademir is an undergraduate student, but he speaks beautifully and he manages all the equipment.
Thank you so much.
And we are very happy. We are so grateful for you to have accepted this invitation.
Oh, we did it instantly.
We were thrilled.
Yes, it meant so much to us because it is. It's been a long time, and
We must get together more often. Yes.
Yeah, these are difficult times.
It's very true. There's nothing like this group anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
Thanks to you, because
thanks to you.
No, really, Don. It all began at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill when we met a group of students. I was there on my first postdoctoral license sabbatical.
I remember when we first met at the beginning of the year party.
Yes, and we began to meet to read your book.
Yes, without me, I'd like to say.
Well,
I was not invited to that.
Every once in a while we would send you questions.
That's right.
By email, and I remember Jeff was a very intriguing person because he could be so laid back that he would sit in the corridor and talk to me for hours with the students. Do you remember that, Jeff? You were not the dean, so you had the time to talk shop, as the English say, and it was so wonderful that time.
Yeah, it was great.
We had the circle, the moral philosophy circle, that would meet at your house. Of the,
Yes.
The Research Triangle Ethics Circle.
yes, I went to those meetings once or twice, I think.
So it was a
It was so
monthly
good.
meeting where people would present their work in ethics, and it
Yes, it was so very beautiful.
So maybe next time we can all get Zoom backgrounds of Caldwell Hall in Chapel Hill, and we can meet at your place.
Yes.
I'll add a long connection. The person I think I've known the longest is Jackie, and
Jackie.
I met her on an airplane.
Really?
Yeah, going to Australia for a Hume conference, and we
Oh,
landed in Sydney, and I tagged along because she did good research. This is pre-Google, so she had done research about where she might stay, and when I traveled then, I didn't do any research because all the information was the less good place. So went with Jackie, and she had gotten a reservation at the Waratah Hotel.
Uh-huh.
And we went there, and they weren't open. So then we went to a cafe that was open, and we're sitting down, and we're exhausted. And we're looking at the menu. And I thought I was just fantasizing because it was as if Aristotle was on the menu. And it turned out it was Aristotle's Cafe, and it was run by a Greek immigrant named Aristotle. And then we each got rooms in the Waratah, and I got a basement room because I said it didn't matter. And then the woman said, "Would you like a better room?" And I said, "I'm kind of a cheapskate, but a room with a window would be nice." And she gave me the room at the top floor, where I've stayed since a few times. Anyway, so I've known Jackie. It was after you were a graduate student here, though, right?
Yes, I was a grad student. I was working on my dissertation at Chicago. And this is a conference where I also met Don. Had you not met Don prior to Canberra?
I don't think I had.
Because you two were like a riot at that conference. If you remember.
At that conference?
What Hume conference did we meet at? Did we meet at Marburg? Was that the Hume conference?
Oh, I was at Marburg. Maybe that's when we met.
Oh, God.
I think we knew each other already in Canberra.
Yeah, that's where we
was Canberra before Park City or after? I don't remember.
After, because Marburg was the first one I went to. But that's where we would ask people, what's the most embarrassing thing you've ever done? And we'd go around, and then people would say something kind of mild, and we'd be super reactive to it.
I do think you two could moonlight as a dual comedy act. Don't you think?
Yes, but it's a very, sort of philosophical comedy act.
Of course, yes, of course. But they can magic tricks, everything. They have many things.
Well, we are so lucky at this dire time that we have Zoom, because it makes a world of difference in connecting with people who you cannot see in person right now.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think
tell me.
Don was suggesting, Livia, that you are what has sustained Grupo Hume. It's really, I think, such an accomplishment. And we're so lucky because I think without it, it would be much more difficult for us to meet your Brazilian colleagues.
Yeah.
Well, the groups has sustained me, actually, because these are wonderful people.
Mm-hmm.
They are brilliant, and they are nice and friendly, and they bring sweetness and kindness and light to everybody's life. And I think that it's a lot because of people who are drawn to the study of
Yeah.
are good people.
Unlike the people who are drawn to the study of Kant in general.
Oh, they are a bit crazy in the head, I think.
Yeah. Are we still live streaming this on YouTube, Jeff?
No, no, not
Oh,
anymore.
good, good, good.
We are on YouTube.
Are we live now?
We are.
No,
Yeah,
no.
you just said it live on YouTube. Yeah.
But I think, Jeff, you were referring to Kantians. It's a different sense of humor that they have, right?
Oh,
Yes,
you,
it's
oh,
we
Jeff.
are making humor now.
I was just following the implications. That's all.
You meant, not can't. Can't.
Can't. Like, not David Hume, Donald Hume.
Yeah. His scurrilous brother.
His scurrilous brother, who said all of those things that people think that David Hume said, but didn't, like the
Exactly.
like the
Now
crude emotivism and the skepticism about all practical reasoning. And
of course. But do you know that Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, the brilliant philosopher, the great philosopher, once earned his living by playing billiards professionally?
Ooh. That's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
That's cool.
Yeah.
yeah, so presumably Hume just watched billiards a lot.
And he kept puzzling. How does one stop and the other move? It makes no sense.
Yeah. You know, like human psychology would be very different if the impression of necessary connection were just a little bit more pleasurable. People constantly watching billiard balls collide and say, I knew it. Yeah.
Collide.
Yeah. Inference. It's a lot more pleasant because you're constantly making those inferences.
I will make this experiment.
If there were a providential God could have just made that just a little bit more pleasant.
Right?
Oh, please, we must not be live on YouTube anymore. We are tired of being, entertaining.
I think it's fair to say nobody's watching at this point anyway, but still.
Maybe that's the part everyone is watching.
God is watching.
16 people still watching.
16.
Hey, 16. Let's do something.
So unfortunately, I have to go. But
oh, thank you.
I really love seeing all of you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
And,
thank you so much.
Thank you for the great talks, Jackie and Don.
Oh, thank you, Jack.
And Simon.
And Simon and Angie.
I missed Angie's talk because I thought it was this morning. I was all set to do it this morning and then discovered too late yesterday.
Oh, I did see it this morning.
It was super interesting.
This morning, but I think it was posted on the
on YouTube
site.
Yeah,
it's still there.
Yeah.
Oh, is it still there? Great, I'll look at it.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yes.
It was great to see you guys. I have to go too because I have to teach this afternoon.
Oh, I'm so sorry. But
teaching?
have a good class.
I'm
Wonderful
teaching
class.
Okay, we'll have a group. Goodbye to everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Zip out. Wonderful to see you all. Thank you.
Love you guys.
Love
Thank
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Miss you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Ciao, ciao.
Lívia,
Yeah.
você poderia dizer algumas palavras de adeus e de agradecimento como membro fundadora? Seria bacana nós encerrarmos a transmissão.
Sim. Pessoal, muito obrigada a vocês por terem acompanhado conosco esses dias de celebração das atividades do Grupo Hume. como vocês viram no finalzinho, tudo acabou em brincadeira, em piada, em diversão, muito no espírito do trabalho desse grupo, que se caracteriza pelo companheirismo, colaboração e contínuo estudo, esforço coletivo e a curiosidade insaciável acerca do pensamento do filósofo David Hume. Eu penso que esse amor intelectual, mais os nossos laços de amizade, que são muito fortes, a confiança que temos umas nas outras, são o que tem tido a continuidade do trabalho desse grupo e que é, na verdade, um coletivo. O Vinícius me convidou a dizer esse muito, muito, muito obrigado, muito obrigada às pessoas que celebraram com a gente esse aniversário, mas o que eu estou dizendo, eu penso, é o que qualquer outra de nós diria, porque são as palavras coletivas, desse coletivo, que é isso. Gosta de conviver, de estudar, se inspira sempre pela visão e pela compreensão de natureza humana do querido, admirável pensador escocês David Hume, que, embora tenha nascido num solo distante, tem um bocado a dizer para a nossa sensibilidade, porque ele tem um jeito de ser, na minha opinião, pelo menos. Alguém mais quer falar um pouquinho? Dar um tchau? Por favor.
Bom, eu gostaria de agradecer meus colegas da organização, a Alana Café, o Ademir, que comandou toda a parte técnica do nosso encontro. Sem o Ademir, não tinha tido encontro virtual. O Vinícius Amaral, também ao Marcos Balheiro, que esteve conosco em todas as reuniões desde ontem, nos ajudou bastante. A Carlota também, que esteve presente em algumas das nossas sessões pelo Zoom. A todos que acompanharam, tiveram paciência de ficar sentados diante do computador, às vezes ouvindo essa conversa que nem sempre é intelectual, mas a gente tem que admitir, é agradável. E é isso. E agradecer o apoio também do nosso programa de pós, que nos ajudou com a realização desse encontro. E isso é tudo.
Felicidades, pessoal. Se cuidem. E até breve.
Até breve.